I am Simon, 69 years old, and a widower who always preferred a quiet and unassuming life. Last Tuesday, my daughter-in-law slid an eviction notice across my kitchen table, giving me exactly 24 hours to vacate the small cottage I lived in. She smirked, telling me my poverty was a burden on her future and that a rundown nursing home was where I truly belonged. She had no idea her supposedly broke father-in-law actually owned 3 prime commercial properties and held a net worth of $5.5 million. She also had no idea that I secretly owned the luxury penthouse she currently slept in. I just nodded and smiled at her demands. That night, her electronic key stopped working. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach an arrogant person a very expensive and permanent lesson. The sharp slap of heavy paper against my solid oak dining table broke the peaceful silence of my Tuesday morning. I looked down at the document resting next to my coffee mug. It was a formal eviction notice printed on high-quality legal paper. I slowly looked up. Megan, my 32-year-old daughter-in-law, stood in the center of my small kitchen with her arms tightly crossed over her designer trench coat. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled and her eyes held a cold and calculated disdain. She did not even bother to take off her expensive sunglasses inside my home. "You have 24 hours to pack your things, Simon," she said. Her voice was sharp, dripping with the kind of upper-class entitlement that instantly made my stomach turn. I already called the Sunnyside retirement facility on the edge of town. They have an available bed in their shared ward. It is cheap and basic, which fits your limited budget perfectly. I looked from the eviction notice back to her face. I lived in this modest 2-bedroom cottage on a quiet wooded plot of land. To Megan, my home was nothing more than a real estate gold mine she wanted to exploit for quick cash. "This is my home," I replied. My voice remained entirely calm and steady. I did not raise it. I did not shake. Megan let out a harsh, mocking laugh that echoed off the wooden walls. "This place is a massive waste of space. Aaron and I need serious capital right now. My new tech startup needs a major cash injection, and renting out this cottage to wealthy college students will easily generate $3,000 a month. We simply cannot afford to subsidize your poverty anymore. You are a financial burden, Simon. You sit here all day reading books and contributing absolutely nothing to our upward mobility. It is time for you to face reality and step aside." Her words were explicitly designed to humiliate me. She wanted me to feel incredibly small. She wanted the poor, retired African-American man to bow his head in shame and submit to her superior business acumen. I picked up the mug of black coffee I had brewed just 10 minutes prior. I took a slow sip, feeling the bitter warmth spread through my chest, keeping my intense anger firmly locked behind a wall of pure ice. I shifted my gaze to the man standing silently slightly behind her. Aaron, my 35-year-old son. The boy I had raised with my late wife Cora, working day and night to ensure he had every opportunity to succeed in this world. He wore an expensive tailored suit ironically paid for by the lavish lifestyle I secretly funded from the shadows. Yet despite the expensive clothes and the polished appearance, he looked incredibly weak. He kept his eyes fixed firmly on the scuffed wooden floorboards, completely refusing to meet my gaze. "Aaron," I said. His name hung heavily in the tense air of the kitchen. "Are you really going to stand there and look at your shoes while your wife throws me out onto the street?" Aaron shifted his weight uncomfortably. He rubbed the back of his neck, a nervous habit he had carried since he was a little boy facing a difficult math test. He finally looked up, but his eyes were filled with a pathetic mixture of guilt and sheer desperation. "Dad, you have to try to understand," Aaron stammered. His voice lacked any trace of the confidence a grown man should possess. "Megan has a really solid business plan. The startup is entering a crucial phase and we need liquid assets to secure our investors. Sunnyside is not that bad of a place. They have medical staff on hand and bingo on Thursdays. It is just practical economics. We are thinking about the future of our family." Practical economics. My own flesh and blood was reciting corporate talking points that Megan had clearly drilled into his head on the car ride over. I placed my coffee mug down on the table with a firm thud. I leaned forward, resting my large hands on the oak wood. "I raised a strong man, Aaron," I said, injecting cold steel into my tone. Or at least I desperately tried to. "I taught you to protect your family at all costs. I taught you to stand your ground and defend your blood. Now I look at you and I only see a coward who hides behind his wife while she evicts his widowed father to fund her personal vanity project. Is this really what you have become?" Aaron flinched visibly, as if I had physically struck him across the face. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to defend whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left in his soul. But Megan immediately stepped right in front of him, physically shielding him, and taking total control of the narrative. "Do not try to guilt-trip him with your outdated family values," Megan snapped. She slammed her perfectly manicured hand flat on the table, leaning in close to my face. "Aaron is an equal partner in my vision. He is doing exactly what it takes to secure our financial future, a future you have never been able to provide for him. You were a low-level worker your entire life. You live in a rotting shack. We live in a luxury penthouse downtown. Aaron is finally leveling up in the world, and you are just dead weight holding him back from his true potential." I looked around Megan and stared directly at Aaron again. I gave him one last defining chance to be a son. "Is that true, Aaron? Am I just dead weight to you?" Aaron swallowed hard. He looked at Megan, clearly waiting for her silent approval, then looked back down at the floor. "It is just business, Dad. Please just pack your bags and make this easy for everyone." That was it. The final fragile thread connecting me to the boy I had raised snapped cleanly in two. There was no going back from this absolute betrayal. He had made his choice, and he had chosen greed over his own father. Megan smiled triumphantly. She picked up her expensive leather purse and adjusted the collar of her coat. She had won, or so she firmly believed in her arrogant mind. She had completely conquered the weak, defenseless old man. "You have exactly 24 hours, Simon," she reiterated, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. "If you are not entirely gone by tomorrow morning, I will personally have the police escort you off the premises for trespassing on my rental property. Have a wonderful day packing." She turned on her heel and marched out the front door, her heels clicking aggressively against the wood. Aaron lingered behind for a fraction of a second. He opened his mouth, perhaps wanting to utter a hollow apology to make himself feel better, but Megan called his name sharply from the driveway. Like a well-trained dog, he scurried out after her without saying another word. The heavy front door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the quiet cottage. I did not cry. I did not collapse into my chair in a fit of despair or grief. I felt absolutely no sorrow, only a cold, calculating, and ruthless clarity. For years I had carefully hidden my vast wealth. I had lived a simple life in this cottage because it was where my beautiful wife Cora and I had spent our very best years together. I wore cheap clothes and drove an old beat-up truck to ensure my son would build his own path free from the corrupting and lazy influence of unearned money. I had quietly subsidized his downtown luxury apartment through an anonymous shell corporation, believing I was giving him a safe financial net while he found his footing in the corporate world. Instead, my financial protection had turned him into a weak, entitled pawn, and it had brought a greedy parasite into my family. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I dialed a specific number I knew by heart. The phone rang exactly twice before a crisp, highly professional voice answered the line. "Jonathan," I said, addressing my corporate attorney and wealth manager. "Good morning, Simon," Jonathan replied smoothly. "What do you need done today?" I walked over to the front window. I watched Megan's luxury SUV back out of my gravel driveway, speeding away toward the city skyline. They were heading back to their glamorous, wealthy life, a life funded entirely by my secret grace. "I need you to contact the building management at the downtown tower immediately," I instructed, my voice utterly devoid of any emotion. "Revoke the electronic access cards for Penthouse 402. Terminate the lease subsidy program effectively today." "Understood," Jonathan said, asking no unnecessary questions because he knew exactly how I operated. "When do you want this lockout executed?" I watched the dust finally settle in the empty driveway. "Tonight." I sat in my worn leather armchair. The grandfather clock chimed 7 times. On my lap rested a sleek tablet. Jonathan had arranged for the live security feed of the Pinnacle lobby to be routed directly to my secure network. I watched the pristine marble floors and the crystal chandeliers of the building I had purchased outright 5 years ago. At exactly 7:14, the revolving glass doors spun. Megan and Aaron walked in. Megan marched with her nose in the air, swinging her designer shopping bags from her afternoon spending spree. Aaron trailed behind her, carrying her overflow. They bypassed the concierge desk, heading straight for the private residential elevators reserved for the penthouse suites. Megan barely paused as she slapped her gold-trimmed keycard against the electronic reader. A harsh, bright red light flashed on the scanner. The heavy mahogany doors remained completely shut. Megan scoffed, visibly annoyed, and slapped the card against the reader a second time. Another red flash. She turned and snapped at Aaron, commanding him to use his card. Aaron fumbled in his tailored slacks, pulled out his own keycard, and pressed it to the sensor. Red light. Denied. Megan threw her hands up in exasperated fury and stomped over to the concierge desk. Before she could unleash her venom on the young receptionist, the building manager stepped out from his glass office. Mr. Sterling was a meticulously dressed man who knew exactly who signed his very generous paychecks. He approached my son and daughter-in-law with his hands clasped neatly behind his back. His face was a mask of absolute professional indifference. I turned up the volume on my tablet. I could hear every word perfectly. Megan demanded an immediate explanation for the broken elevator. Mr. Sterling did not flinch. He looked her directly in the eyes and delivered the script Jonathan had provided him. "There is no malfunction, madam," Mr. Sterling stated coldly. "The true owner of Penthouse 402 has permanently revoked your access to the residential floors. You no longer reside in this building. Please surrender your keycards and exit the premises immediately." Megan stared at the building manager as if he had grown a second head. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the grand lobby, broken only by the soft jazz playing through the overhead speakers. Then the realization hit her, and the pristine mask of upper-class sophistication completely shattered. Megan slammed her manicured hands onto the marble concierge desk. "What are you talking about?" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "We hold the lease to that penthouse. My husband is a top executive. We pay premium management fees. You are nothing but a glorified doorman. Fix the system right now, or I will have you fired by tomorrow morning." Mr. Sterling did not even blink. He maintained his rigid posture, thoroughly unimpressed by her theatrics. "You are mistaken, madam," he replied with icy precision. "You do not hold any lease, nor have you ever paid a single dollar in management fees. Your occupancy was entirely subsidized by a private shell corporation. That corporation terminated the arrangement at noon today. We have already packed your personal belongings into standard cardboard boxes. They are currently sitting in the basement loading dock awaiting your retrieval. Now I must ask you to lower your voice or I will call security." Megan turned violently toward Aaron. Her face was flushed an ugly shade of crimson. Aaron stood completely paralyzed. He looked around the lobby like a frightened child. This was the exact moment the humiliation escalated from a private inconvenience to a public spectacle. The elevator chimed and a group of the building elite residents stepped out into the lobby. I recognized Mrs. Harrington and Judge Carter. They were wealthy, influential people Megan had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to impress at building association galas. They stopped in their tracks, watching with absolute disgust as Megan screamed at the staff. "Look at them, Aaron!" Megan shrieked wildly, gesturing toward the staff. "Do something. Be a man for once in your life and fix this mess." Aaron weakly approached Mr. Sterling, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "There must be some kind of clerical error," Aaron muttered, his voice cracking under the intense scrutiny of the onlookers. "We just need to go upstairs and make a few phone calls. We can sort this out." Mr. Sterling crossed his arms. "There is no error, sir. You have 10 minutes to collect your boxes from the basement before I have them thrown into the dumpster. Do not make me ask you to leave again." Megan let out a sound of pure, unadulterated rage. She noticed the wealthy neighbors staring at her, and her face contorted in a mix of profound embarrassment and furious denial. In her mind, she could not fathom that she was actually being evicted. She needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to blame for this inexplicable disaster. And in her twisted logic, her mind went straight to the old broke man she had just evicted that morning. "It is your pathetic father," she hissed at Aaron loudly enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. "He must have done something. He probably tampered with our mail or filed a false report out of pure spite because I told him to pack his filthy bags. I knew he was a vindictive old loser. Give me my phone." She aggressively snatched her smartphone from her designer purse. Her fingers punched the screen with lethal force. She paced back and forth across the marble floor, her expensive heels clicking aggressively, totally ignoring the disgusted whispers of the affluent residents she had worked so hard to court. She held the phone to her ear, breathing heavily, ready to unleash a torrent of abuse upon the poor, helpless old man she thought she had conquered. I sat in my cottage watching her dial. A second later, my personal cell phone began to ring on the table beside me. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the absolute desperation radiating from the screen before I slowly picked it up. I pressed the phone to my ear and remained completely silent. Megan did not even wait for a greeting. She launched into a hysterical tirade, her voice completely unhinged. "Simon, what did you do?" she screamed into the receiver. "You vindictive, pathetic old man. Did you call the management office and lie to them? Did you mess with our mail? You think you can sabotage our lives just because you are bitter about moving to a nursing home? You are going to call them right now and fix this, or I swear I will ruin you. I will make sure you end up on the street instead of a care facility." I let her scream until she ran out of breath. I listened to Erin in the background, weakly begging her to lower her voice. I took a deep, steadying breath and finally spoke. My voice was low, resonant, and entirely devoid of any mercy. "I did not lie to anyone, Megan," I stated methodically. "I simply instructed my wealth manager to make a single phone call. The corporate shell company that subsidizes your luxurious lifestyle is called Cora Holdings. I named it after my late wife. I own Cora Holdings. I own the entire building you are currently standing in. That penthouse is mine." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and profound. I could hear the faint, hollow sound of her shallow breathing. I watched the security feed as all the color violently drained from her face. "Your $4,000 a month housing allowance is permanently terminated." I continued driving the blade deeper with every single word. "You are officially homeless." Furthermore, the custom Italian furniture currently decorating that penthouse was purchased on my corporate credit account. Since you have made it explicitly clear that we are operating strictly on business terms, I expect full reimbursement. You currently owe me $80,000 for the furniture. I suggest you find a very lucrative way to generate some serious capital, Megan. The real world is a very expensive place. I did not wait for her to respond. I pressed the red button on my screen and ended the call. I placed the phone back on the table, picked up my tea, and watched the security feed as my daughter-in-law collapsed onto the cold marble floor of the lobby. The grandfather clock in my hallway struck midnight, its deep chimes resonating through the dark, quiet cottage. I sat in my armchair, the tablet now dark, waiting. I knew he would come. Cowards always run back to the very people they betrayed when the real world finally punches them in the mouth. Headlights cut through the darkness outside my window, sweeping across the living room walls. The crunch of tires on gravel signaled the arrival of a vehicle. A moment later, frantic, heavy pounding rattled my front door. I stood up, smoothed the wrinkles from my simple cardigan, and unlocked the deadbolt. Aaron stood on my porch, completely drenched from a sudden midnight downpour. His expensive tailored suit was ruined, clinging to his shaking frame. His tie was gone, his collar torn open, and his eyes were red and swollen. Before I could even say a word, he pushed past me into the hallway and collapsed directly onto his knees on the hardwood floor. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob. It was not the quiet, dignified grief of a man who realized he had made a terrible mistake. It was the loud, pathetic wailing of a child who had been caught stealing and was terrified of the punishment. "Dad, please," Aaron choked out, gasping for air. "Please forgive me. We have absolutely nothing. The building manager actually threw our boxes into the alley. My credit cards are declining. We are sleeping in my car tonight. I am begging you, please do not do this to us." I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity. My heart, which had once beaten only to provide this boy with a good life, felt like solid granite. "Get up off my floor, Aaron," I commanded, my voice sharp and uncompromising. "I am not interested in your tears. I am interested in the truth. Stop crying and tell me exactly why Megan was so desperate to rent out this tiny cottage for a few $1,000s when you are supposedly a highly paid executive. What is the real financial panic you are hiding?" Aaron slowly raised his head. He stayed on his knees, his hands trembling violently against his thighs. He looked at me with a terrified expression, realizing that the gentle, accommodating father he had known his entire life was completely gone. I walked over to the kitchen counter, poured myself a fresh glass of water, and waited. The silence in the room stretched until it became unbearable for him. Aaron swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. "Megan's startup is completely bankrupt," Aaron whispered, his voice shaking with absolute dread. "Her primary investors pulled their funding 6 months ago. She spent all their money on luxury office spaces, marketing parties, and designer clothes to build an image of success. When the capital dried up, she panicked. She told me she just needed a bridge loan, a temporary cash injection to keep the doors open until the next round of funding came through." I leaned against the counter, my eyes locked on his pathetic form. "And your executive salary could not cover it," I stated flatly. Aaron let out a broken, miserable laugh. "I am not an executive dad. I am a mid-level project manager. I make a fraction of what Megan tells her friends I make. My entire paycheck goes toward the car leases, the country club memberships, and the credit card minimums, just to keep up the illusion. We have been completely broke for over a year. Your housing subsidy was the only thing keeping a roof over our heads. I narrowed my eyes, piecing together the timeline. So you needed a massive lump sum of cash to save Megan's vanity project. But you have no assets, no equity, and terrible credit. How exactly did you secure a business loan without collateral? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Aaron closed his eyes, fresh tears streaming down his face. He wrapped his arms around his own stomach as if he were in physical pain. I did not get a business loan, Dad, he sobbed, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. I got a home equity line of credit. I took out a loan for $150,000. I stood perfectly still. The gravity of his words hit me like a freight train. You took out a loan against a property, I said, my voice dangerously low. But you do not own any property, Aaron. You rent an apartment. The only property in our family is this cottage. Aaron nodded slowly, keeping his eyes squeezed shut. The bank required collateral, he cried. Megan said it was the only way to save the company. She said we would pay it back in 6 months and you would never even know it happened. I took a step toward him. The anger I had kept carefully controlled all day finally began to surface hot and destructive. I own this cottage free and clear, I said, pronouncing every single word with deadly precision. The deed is in my name alone. The bank would never approve a collateral loan without the primary owner's notarized signature. How did you get the loan, Aaron? Aaron buried his face in his hands again, his shoulders shaking violently. I forged it, he wailed, his voice cracking with pure shame. I stole your old tax documents from the filing cabinet when we visited for Thanksgiving. I practiced your signature for weeks. I used a corrupt notary Megan knew from her networking events to stamp the paperwork. I committed bank fraud, Dad. I forged your name and I put a $150,000 lien on your home. If we do not make the balloon payment next month, the bank is going to foreclose on this cottage. That is why Megan wanted to evict you so urgently. She needed to rent the place out to cover the minimum monthly interest payments before the bank auditors realized the loan was completely toxic. She was willing to throw you into a miserable nursing home just to cover up our federal crimes. I stared at the man cowering on my floor. My own flesh and blood had committed identity theft, bank fraud, and forgery against me. He had risked making me homeless just to appease his greedy wife. Before I could respond to his sickening confession, the front door violently swung open. The heavy wood slammed against the wall with a loud bang. Megan marched into the hallway, soaking wet from the rain, her designer coat ruined, but her posture still radiating absolute arrogance. She had clearly followed him here, taking a taxi after realizing he had taken the car. She looked down at Aaron kneeling on the floor and sneered with profound disgust. Get up, Aaron, she spat, her voice laced with pure venom. Stop groveling like a pathetic child. It makes me sick to look at you. She stepped over her husband as if he were a piece of trash and walked directly up to me. She was no longer trying to play the sophisticated socialite. She was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are utterly ruthless. I see the idiot finally told you about the loan, Megan said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous calculating light. Good. That actually saves me the trouble of explaining it to you. She crossed her arms, standing tall in my hallway. She believed she still held the winning hand. You are not going to do anything about this. Simon, she stated, her voice dripping with absolute certainty, you are going to pay off that $150,000 loan with your hidden millions, and then you are going to sign the deed of this cottage completely over to me to cover the damages you caused by locking us out of our apartment tonight. I stared at her, genuinely amazed by the sheer magnitude of her audacity. You just confessed to organizing bank fraud and forgery, I said coldly. What makes you think I will not call the police right now and hand them your husband on a silver platter? Megan laughed, a harsh, wicked sound that echoed in the small space. Because he is your only son, Simon. If you report the fraud, Aaron goes to federal prison for 5 to 10 years. You will destroy his entire life. But if you try to act tough and deny me the house, I will make the first move. I will call Adult Protective Services tomorrow morning. I will tell them you are suffering from severe dementia, that you are having erratic, paranoid delusions, and that you are financially cutting off your family in a fit of elderly madness. I will have a state-appointed guardian declare you legally insane, and I will take control of your assets anyway. The choice is yours, old man. I stared at her, watching the sheer arrogance radiate from her posture. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of fear. I simply pointed to my front door and ordered them both off my property. Megan grabbed Aaron by the arm and dragged him out into the rain, slamming the door behind them. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought I would spend the night trembling in fear of Adult Protective Services. They were gravely mistaken. I did not sleep a single wink that night. Instead, I made a phone call to Jonathan Pierce. By 6 o'clock the next morning, I was sitting in the immaculate waiting room of Dr. Harrison Vance, the most respected forensic psychiatrist in the state. Jonathan had pulled several high-level favors to arrange this emergency off-the-books appointment before the clinic even officially opened its doors to the public. I was not going to sit around and wait for Megan to execute her malicious threat. I was going to neutralize her weapon before she could even draw it. Dr. Vance subjected me to a grueling, comprehensive battery of cognitive and psychological evaluations. He tested my memory, my spatial reasoning, my executive functioning, and my emotional stability. We spent over 2 hours discussing my financial decisions, my family dynamics, and my overall awareness of my personal estate. I answered every single question with absolute chilling clarity. I solved his logic puzzles without a moment of hesitation. I recalled long sequences of numbers and complex patterns flawlessly. When the rigorous assessment finally concluded, Dr. Vance set his pen down on his pristine glass desk. He looked at me with deep professional respect. He stated that I possessed the mental acuity of a man 20 years my junior. He immediately drafted and notarized an ironclad, legally binding certificate of mental competency. This document categorically confirmed that I was fully capable of managing my own vast financial affairs and that any claims of dementia or erratic paranoia were completely baseless. I folded that certified document and placed it securely in my breast pocket. Megan's entire strategy relied on painting me as a confused, helpless old man. With one piece of paper, I had entirely dismantled her primary avenue of attack. She could call Adult Protective Services all she wanted. They would take one look at Dr. Vance's certified psychological evaluation and laugh her right out of the building. While I was securing my mental health clearance, Jonathan Pierce was orchestrating a devastating financial strike across town. I had instructed him to trace every single penny of the $150,000 loan Aaron had fraudulently secured against my cottage. Jonathan is a corporate shark who thrives on destroying the enemies of his clients, and he moved with terrifying speed. By 8 o'clock that morning, his team of forensic accountants had completely mapped the flow of the illicit funds. They tracked the wire transfers from the corrupt notary directly into the primary operating accounts of Megan's failing technology startup. The money had been heavily commingled with her remaining business assets, a desperate attempt to hide the paper trail and keep her facade alive. Armed with the irrefutable evidence of bank fraud and forged signatures, Jonathan approached a sympathetic commercial judge he knew well. He presented the undeniable proof that stolen, fraudulent funds were currently sitting in Megan's corporate accounts. The judge did not hesitate. He signed a rapid emergency ex parte injunction. The legal order commanded the immediate and total freezing of all financial assets associated with Megan and her startup. The trap snapped shut before Megan even had a chance to drink her morning coffee. I sat in the leather chair of the clinic lobby waiting for my driver when Jonathan called me with the update. His voice was laced with dark satisfaction. He informed me that the freeze had been successfully executed across all banking institutions. Megan's business accounts were locked. Her personal checking accounts were frozen. Even her credit cards, which were tied to the startup's collateral, were entirely disabled. She was left with a literal zero balance. Jonathan painted a vivid picture of the chaos currently unfolding. He had received a frantic call from the bank manager handling Megan's accounts. Megan had apparently tried to pay for her luxury gym membership and her card had declined. She had stormed into her local bank branch, screaming at the tellers, demanding to know why her funds were inaccessible. The bank manager coldly informed her that a federal fraud hold had been placed on her entire portfolio pursuant to a judge's direct order. She could not withdraw a single dollar. She could not pay her employees. She could not pay the corrupt notary she had hired. She could not even afford to hire a decent defense attorney to fight the injunction. I listened to Jonathan's report, feeling a deep, quiet sense of justice. Megan had threatened to throw me onto the street and strip me of my resources. In return, I had surgically removed her ability to survive in the wealthy world she worshipped. I had cut off her oxygen. She was now stranded in a cheap motel with Aaron possessing no cash, no credit, and no way to fight back against the massive legal machine I had just unleashed upon her. I thanked Jonathan for his exceptional work and instructed him to prepare the next phase of our strategy. If Megan wanted to play a ruthless game of financial warfare, I was going to ensure she understood exactly who she was fighting. I ended the call and stood up from the lobby chair, adjusting my coat. Just as I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the psychiatric clinic, my personal cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the bright screen. The caller ID displayed an unknown number, but the area code belonged to the affluent, predominantly white suburbs on the north side of the city. I swiped the screen and brought the device to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited. A deep, gravelly voice echoed through the speaker, dripping with a sickening blend of false polite charm and aggressive, condescending arrogance. It was Thomas, Megan's father. I had met the man only a handful of times at awkward family gatherings. He owned a regional furniture manufacturing business and constantly carried himself with the inflated pride of a man who believed his race and his moderate wealth made him inherently superior to everyone else in the room. He had always spoken to me slowly, treating me like an uneducated subordinate who should be grateful just to sit at his dining table. Now his tone was tightly coiled with suppressed rage. "Listen to me very carefully, old man," Thomas sneered, skipping any pleasantries. "Megan just called me crying her eyes out from a bank lobby. I know exactly what you and your high-priced lawyer are trying to pull with this ridiculous financial freeze. You think you are being clever, but you are playing a game you do not understand and you cannot possibly win." I remained completely silent, letting him dig his own grave with his arrogant words. "Let us not make this a race issue," Simon Thomas continued, his voice lowering into a harsh, racialized threat. "You people always try to overcompensate when you get a little bit of leverage. My daughter made a small business mistake and you are blowing it entirely out of proportion. I have powerful friends in this city. I have judges and politicians on my payroll. You are going to call your lawyer right now and you are going to drop that freeze immediately. If you do not back down and learn your place, my family will ruin you. We will crush you so completely that you will wish you had taken that bed in the nursing home." I lowered the phone from my ear and ended the call without saying a single word to Thomas. I stepped out of the clinic and into my waiting vehicle, instructing my driver to take me back to my cottage. The rain from the previous night had cleared, leaving the air crisp and cold, a perfect match for my mood. I had barely been home for an hour, settling into my armchair with a fresh cup of tea, when the unmistakable crunch of heavy tires on gravel echoed through the front window. A pristine silver Mercedes-Benz rolled up my driveway. It parked aggressively close to my front steps, tearing up a patch of the lawn. The doors opened. Thomas stepped out wearing a sharp navy suit that strained against his wide frame. His wife Linda emerged from the passenger side, clutching a designer handbag against her chest, as if the very air around my modest home might contaminate her. She surveyed my wooden porch with blatant disgust, whispering something to Thomas that made him sneer. They marched up my steps and pounded on the door. I opened it slowly, adopting a neutral expression. Thomas did not wait for an invitation. He shoved his way past me, forcing me to step back into the hallway, and Linda followed closely behind him. They walked directly into my kitchen, looking around the small space with overwhelming contempt. Thomas stopped at my oak dining table, the exact spot where his daughter had tried to evict me just yesterday. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a crisp checkbook, and aggressively scribbled a number. He ripped the check from the binding and slammed it face down on the wood. "Listen to me, Simon," Thomas barked, pointing a thick finger at my chest. "That is $20,000. That is more money than a man like you has ever seen in one place. You are going to take that check, call your attack dog lawyer, and lift the freeze on my daughter's accounts right this second." I looked down at the piece of paper resting on my table. I knew exactly how to play this game. Men like Thomas were entirely predictable. Their arrogance was a glaring vulnerability, a massive blind spot that could be easily exploited if you knew how to feed their inflated egos. I deliberately let my shoulders slump. I lowered my gaze, widening my eyes to feign a deep, sudden apprehension. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly as I reached out to touch the edge of the check. $20,000, I muttered, ensuring my voice sounded appropriately weak and overwhelmed. "That is a lot of money, sir. I did not mean to cause so much trouble. I just panicked when Megan said she was going to throw me out." Thomas immediately puffed out his chest, completely buying my performance. His posture relaxed from defensive aggression into triumphant superiority. He shoved his hands into his pockets and laughed, a cruel booming sound that filled my small kitchen. Linda scoffed from the doorway, wrinkling her nose. "Of course you panicked," Thomas sneered, stepping closer to loom over me. "You people always panic when real power steps into the room. You got lucky finding a lawyer willing to file some nuisance paperwork, but you have absolutely no idea how the real world operates. You are a retired nobody living in a shack in the woods. I run a regional furniture manufacturing empire. I play golf with the judges who sign those injunctions. I employ hundreds of people. I move millions of dollars every single quarter. Did you really think a man of your background could corner my family and get away with it? I kept my head bowed, staring at the floorboards, suppressing the urge to smile. You are very powerful, Mr. Thomas, I whispered, keeping up the charade of the intimidated old man. I am just worried about the bank loan. The bank might take my house. Thomas waved his hand dismissively, his arrogance completely overriding his common sense. He paced across my kitchen, eager to lecture the poor, uneducated man on how society truly functioned. You take that $20,000 and you pay the minimums on the loan, Thomas instructed, his tone dripping with condescension. You keep your mouth shut and you stay exactly in your lane. That is how this works, Simon. My family builds businesses. We create value. Your family leeches off the system. Your son is a pathetic weakling who could not even provide a decent life for my brilliant daughter. She had to take matters into her own hands to save her company because she married a total failure. You should be apologizing to us for raising such a useless man, Linda chimed in, crossing her arms defensively. Megan has suffered enough dealing with your son, she added sharply. We are being incredibly generous by offering you this handout. You need to take the check and drop this ridiculous legal stunt before my husband decides to crush you entirely. Thomas stopped pacing and leaned over the table, bringing his face uncomfortably close to mine. Let me make this very simple for you, Simon, he growled, his voice dropping into a menacing register. You are going to deposit that check. You are going to tell your lawyer to back off permanently. If you try to fight me, I will drag you through the courts until you are utterly bankrupt. I will make sure you lose this miserable little cottage, and I will personally see to it that you spend your final years rotting in a state-run facility. Do we understand each other, old man? I kept my head lowered for one more second. The trap was set perfectly, but I needed the final, undeniable piece of the puzzle. I looked up at him, maintaining my fearful expression, and let my voice shake. But what about the forged signature? I stammered, clutching the edge of the table. What about the fraud? The bank will find out that Megan made Aaron forge my name on that $150,000 loan document. They committed a federal crime. Thomas rolled his eyes, thoroughly exasperated by my apparent stupidity. He slammed his fist on the table, rattling my coffee mug. I know Megan forged the signature, Thomas shouted, completely losing his temper. I know exactly what she did to get that capital. It was a smart business move to bypass bureaucratic red tape, and I fully supported her decision. But if you speak up and tell the authorities, I will bury your son. I will hire the best defense team in the country and frame Aaron for the entire scheme. He will go to federal prison for a decade, and my daughter will walk away completely clean. The room fell dead silent. I did not move. I did not blink. Then I slowly let go of the table. I straightened my spine, rolling my shoulders back as I stood up to my full height. I was taller than Thomas, and as I dropped the pathetic, trembling act, the air in the kitchen instantly shifted. The fearful old man vanished, replaced by the ruthless corporate titan I truly was. Thomas frowned, taking a confused half-step backward as he registered the sudden chilling transformation in my demeanor. Linda gasped softly from the doorway. You are incredibly arrogant, Thomas, I said, my voice now vibrating with deep, commanding authority. And your arrogance has just destroyed your entire family. I reached under the thick oak rim of my dining table. My fingers found the small strip of adhesive tape. I peeled it back and pulled out a tiny, high-definition micro-recorder. A bright green light blinked steadily on its surface. I placed the device right next to his $20,000 check. Thomas stared at the recorder, the blood draining completely from his face as the realization of his fatal mistake crushed the breath from his lungs. Thomas did not utter another word. He stood completely frozen in my kitchen, his eyes locked on the blinking green light of the micro-recorder resting on the table. The arrogant, booming voice that had just threatened to destroy my son and have me locked in a state-run facility was entirely gone. It was immediately replaced by the suffocating silence of a man who suddenly realized he had walked directly into a slaughterhouse of his own making. Linda grabbed his arm, her manicured fingers digging fiercely into the fabric of his tailored navy suit. She pulled him backward toward the hallway, her face a mask of absolute horror. They turned and practically ran out of my cottage. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind them. I walked to the window and watched as Thomas fumbled with his car keys, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them onto the gravel driveway. He scrambled to pick them up, practically shoving his wife into the passenger seat before diving behind the wheel. They sped out of my property, their silver Mercedes swerving erratically as they fled the consequences of their profound stupidity. I picked up the small recording device, placed it securely in my coat pocket, and called my driver. Less than an hour later, I was sitting in the immaculate glass-walled conference room of Jonathan Pierce. I placed the recorder on the polished mahogany table and pressed play. Jonathan leaned back in his expensive leather chair, steepling his fingers as Thomas's voice filled the room. The clear, high-definition audio captured every single threat, every racial insult, and the explicit, undeniable confession regarding the forged bank documents. When the recording finally finished, Jonathan let out a low, appreciative whistle. He immediately reached for his desk phone. Simon, Jonathan said, a predatory smile spreading across his face. This is absolute checkmate. We have clear evidence of extortion conspiracy to commit bank fraud and accessory after the fact. I will call the district attorney right now. Thomas and his arrogant daughter will be in handcuffs before dinner. I reached out and placed my hand firmly over his phone. Do not call the police yet, I instructed calmly. Jonathan paused, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. You have the smoking gun, Simon. Why wait a single second? I looked out the floor-to-ceiling window at the sprawling city skyline, watching the tiny cars move far below us. Because putting Thomas in a jail cell today is entirely too easy, I explained. To a man like Thomas, prison is a legal problem. But losing his wealth, his status, and his precious corporate empire to the very man he just degraded in my own kitchen, that is a spiritual death. I want to dismantle his entire legacy first. I want him to watch his kingdom crumble, and I want him to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I am the one holding the sledgehammer. Once he has absolutely nothing left, once his pride is completely eradicated, then we will hand this tape to the authorities. Jonathan slowly withdrew his hand from the phone, his smile returning, wider and far more dangerous than before. Jonathan immediately summoned his elite team of forensic financial analysts into the conference room. I instructed them to dissect every single aspect of Thomas's highly boasted furniture manufacturing empire. Thomas had stood in my home and bragged about moving millions of dollars every quarter, claiming to be an untouchable titan of industry. It took Jonathan's highly paid team exactly 3 hours to expose the miserable, rotting truth behind that grand facade. Thomas was not a titan. He was a desperate man standing precariously on a house of cards. The furniture business had been heavily bleeding cash for the past 5 years. To keep up his lavish lifestyle, his expensive cars, and his wife's country club appearances, Thomas had severely over-leveraged his manufacturing plants. He had taken out massive commercial loans using his factory equipment and commercial real estate as collateral to fund his personal vanity. His company was drowning in over $4 million of highly toxic debt, and he was barely making the minimum interest payments. His primary lender, a mid-sized regional bank, had already categorized his loans as high-risk liabilities. They were desperately looking for a way to offload the bad debt before Thomas inevitably declared bankruptcy and left them holding the bag. I authorized Jonathan to initiate a silent, hostile takeover of Thomas's financial life. We utilized a completely untraceable shell corporation registered under the Cora Holdings umbrella. Jonathan approached the regional bank's commercial lending division with a highly aggressive all-cash offer. We proposed to buy the entirety of Thomas's corporate debt at a 10% discount. For the bank, it was an absolute miracle. They could immediately clear $4 million of toxic liabilities from their books without enduring a messy, prolonged foreclosure process in the courts. The bank executives eagerly signed the transfer agreements within 48 hours. The transaction was completely confidential and legally binding. Thomas received a standard automated administrative notice in the mail, informing him that his commercial loans had been sold and transferred to a new holding company. He probably did not even bother to read the fine print. He had no idea that the faceless corporate entity now holding the absolute rights to his factories, his machines, and his personal business assets was entirely controlled by me. I was now his primary creditor. I held the exclusive legal power to demand an immediate audit call in the principal loan amounts and trigger a total corporate foreclosure at the very first sign of a missed payment or covenant breach. Thomas had threatened to drag me through the courts until I was bankrupt. Now I literally owned the roof over his failing business. I instructed Jonathan to prepare the final foreclosure notices. We combed through the complex loan covenants and found 3 separate financial clauses Thomas was currently violating due to his severe lack of liquid capital. All I had to do was sign one piece of paper and a fleet of corporate liquidators would arrive at his factory gates with padlocks and immediate eviction orders. I sat at Jonathan's conference table holding a solid gold fountain pen hovering over the execution documents. The power to utterly destroy the man who had threatened to ruin my family was literally at my fingertips. I was ready to sign. I was ready to bring his hollow empire crashing down to the dirt. Just as the tip of my pen touched the thick legal parchment to authorize the complete foreclosure of Thomas's manufacturing company, my personal cell phone began to vibrate violently on the mahogany table. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed Aaron's name. I considered ignoring it entirely. My son had made his choices, choosing a life of fraud, cowardice, and betrayal over the father who had sacrificed everything to build a life for him. However, the sheer persistence of the ringing indicated a level of panic that demanded my attention. I slowly placed the gold pen down next to the execution order and answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear without offering a single word of greeting. The sound that greeted me was not the composed corporate voice Aaron always tried to project, nor was it the angry defensive tone he had used when Megan was standing right beside him. It was the sound of a man completely and utterly broken. Aaron was weeping hysterically, gasping for air between heavy, agonizing sobs. "Dad, please." Aaron choked out, his voice cracking with a profound, soul-crushing desperation. "Please, you have to stop this. You have to tell your lawyers to drop the financial freeze. You have to let us go." I remained completely silent, staring blankly at the foreclosure document, waiting for my signature. My lack of response only pushed Aaron further into a state of absolute hysteria. "I know what we did was unforgivable," Aaron cried, his words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "I know I deserve to go to prison for the forgery. I know Megan was cruel to you, but you cannot destroy us right now. You cannot leave us out on the street with absolutely nothing." "Things have completely changed, Dad. Everything is different now." I finally spoke, my voice a flat, uncompromising baritone that offered no comfort. "Nothing has changed, Aaron. You committed a federal crime against your own father. There are severe consequences for your actions, and you are going to face every single one of them." "No, Dad, listen to me!" Aaron shrieked, his voice reaching a fever pitch of panic and raw emotion. "Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. You have to stop fighting us. Megan took a test this morning. She just came out of the bathroom holding it. Dad, Megan is pregnant. We are going to have a baby. You are going to be a grandfather. Please do not do this to your own grandchild." I commanded Aaron to come to the cottage immediately so I could look him in the eyes, and then I hung up the phone. Less than 30 minutes later, he arrived. The storm from the previous night had passed, but Aaron looked as though he had been dragged through a hurricane. His clothes were heavily rumpled, his face was unshaven, and his eyes carried a desperate, manic energy. He practically fell through my front door, launching straight into his emotional assault. He stood in my hallway, wringing his hands and begging for mercy. "Dad, please," Aaron pleaded, stepping toward me with outstretched arms. "You have to give us the cottage. Megan is absolutely terrified. The stress of being homeless is going to physically hurt the baby. You cannot put your own grandchild out on the street. We just need this one property to start over. If you sign the deed over to us today, we can secure a small loan, pay off the immediate debts, and prepare a safe, stable home for your grandchild. You and Mom always wanted grandchildren. You cannot turn your back on us now." I stood near the stone fireplace, staring at my son. For the first time since this entire nightmare began, I felt the thick armor around my heart actually begin to crack. A grandchild. The very word carried a heavy, profound weight. My late wife Cora had spent her final years knitting small blankets and dreaming of the day our home would be filled with the sound of little footsteps. The thought of a new life, a continuation of my family line, brought a sudden, unexpected wave of warmth to my chest. I looked at Aaron, seeing flashes of the innocent boy I used to hold, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle in this very driveway. My intense desire to crush his greedy wife wavered. If there was an innocent child involved, a baby who shared my blood, could I really justify destroying their financial foundation entirely? I took a deep breath, lowering my guard for a fraction of a second. I considered offering him a compromise. I would never hand over the deed to Megan, but perhaps I could establish an untouchable trust fund for the child, ensuring my grandchild would never suffer for their parents' profound mistakes. I was actually preparing to offer him a massive financial lifeline. Before I could voice my offer of compromise, I noticed something highly irregular about Aaron's behavior. For a man who was supposedly pouring his heart out over the welfare of his unborn child, his physical movements were completely unnatural. Rather than collapsing into a chair or breaking down as he had done the night before, Aaron stood rigidly in the center of the room. He kept stepping awkwardly to his left, deliberately angling his chest so that he was constantly facing me head-on regardless of where I moved in the room. He then began to ask highly specific, oddly phrased questions that did not fit the emotional tone of a desperate father-to-be. "Dad, you have been under so much stress lately. Aaron said, his voice rising in an artificial theatrical pitch. "Do you not think your memory is starting to slip? You have been acting so confused and paranoid ever since Megan mentioned the nursing home. Do you not agree that your mind is just playing tricks on you regarding the bank loan? You can just admit that you are struggling mentally and we can take over the estate. Just say you agree to give us the cottage right now and all of this stress will be over." His words were incredibly jarring. He was not begging for a fresh start. He was actively trying to lead me into a verbal trap. I narrowed my eyes, scanning his face, and then my gaze dropped to his rumpled dress shirt. It was the same shirt he had worn yesterday, but the second button from the collar looked slightly different from the others. It was marginally thicker, entirely black, and as he shifted his weight, I caught a microscopic flash of light. It was a tiny, rhythmic, blinking red light hidden within the dark plastic of the button. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The momentary warmth I felt for my supposed grandchild instantly vaporized, replaced by an absolute, freezing rage that chilled me to the bone. Aaron was wearing a hidden camera and microphone. Megan was not waiting at the motel. She was sitting in the car or a nearby coffee shop watching and listening to a live audio-visual feed. She had sent my son into my home to execute a premeditated wiretap operation. She needed me to admit to elderly confusion or verbally agree to surrender the property under emotional duress so she could record it and use it as evidence in a legal competency hearing. They were weaponizing my love for a child to entrap me. I stared at the blinking red light. The sheer magnitude of their manipulation was staggering. They had constructed a fictional narrative of a desperate pregnant couple, perfectly designed to exploit the grief of a widower who missed his wife. They believed I was a sentimental old fool who would easily surrender his entire fortune at the mere mention of a baby. They had grossly underestimated my resources, my vigilance, and my total lack of mercy. My jaw tightened. I did not yell. I did not show an ounce of the fury boiling inside my veins. I decided to give Megan exactly the kind of show she wanted to see. Aaron continued to prompt me, stepping closer and asking me to confirm that I was feeling disoriented. He was pushing hard for a soundbite that a judge would accept as proof of my mental decline. I let him talk, letting him believe he was succeeding in his pathetic mission. I slowly walked across the living room until I was standing less than 2 feet away from Aaron. He flinched, assuming I was moving in to embrace him. He raised his hands, preparing to hug the gullible old man he thought he had successfully manipulated. Instead, I bypassed his arms entirely. I leaned in close, lowered my head, and stared directly into the center of the fake black button on his shirt. I made sure my face filled the entire frame of the hidden camera lens so Megan could look directly into my eyes through her screen. "Great acting, Megan," I stated, my voice echoing with icy, terrifying precision. It was a truly brilliant strategy. Send the weeping son to play on the old man's heartstrings. Manufacture a high-stakes emotional crisis about a helpless baby to force a verbal contract on tape. You planned this perfectly to build your guardianship case. I am genuinely impressed by how utterly ruthless you are." Aaron gasped, his eyes widening in pure horror as he realized I had discovered the wiretap. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest, but I stepped forward, keeping my eyes locked firmly on the camera lens. "But you made one fatal miscalculation, Megan." I continued, my tone dropping into a deadly whisper. "When you first threatened to throw me onto the street and declared war on me, I did not just freeze your bank accounts. I instructed my private investigator to conduct a comprehensive background check on every single aspect of your life. He pulled your financial records, your criminal history, and your medical files." I paused, allowing the agonizing weight of my words to transmit clearly through the microphone. "I read the medical report from your private gynecologist, Megan. I declared dismantling her entire world with a single devastating fact. I know exactly what procedure you paid for 4 years ago before you even married my son. You had your fallopian tubes surgically tied. It is a permanent, irreversible procedure. You are medically incapable of conceiving a child. There is no pregnancy. There is no baby. You sent my son in here to cry over a phantom child just to steal my house." I reached out, ripped the button camera straight off Aaron's shirt, threw it onto the hardwood floor, and crushed it completely beneath the heel of my shoe. The sound of the shattering plastic echoed loudly, officially terminating her broadcast and severing her final lifeline. The sound of the crushed plastic button echoed in the quiet room. Aaron stared at the sharp pieces of the destroyed hidden camera scattered across my hardwood floor. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving him looking like a hollow shell of a human being. He fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch the broken plastic. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. He whispered that she had shown him a positive pregnancy test just that morning. She had cried tears of joy in his arms. I looked down at my son with a mixture of disgust and profound pity. I told him Megan had likely purchased a fake test online or borrowed one from a friend. She had weaponized his deepest desire to build a family, using it as a cheap tool to execute a real estate scam against his own father. The absolute truth finally pierced through his thick layer of denial. The woman he had sacrificed his integrity for had played him for a complete fool. Aaron did not scream. He did not try to defend her. He slowly stood up, turned around, and walked out of my cottage without speaking a single word. He drove his car back to the cheap, rundown roadside motel where Megan was waiting. According to the private investigator who was actively tailing them, Aaron walked into the dingy motel room, packed his single canvas duffel bag, and walked right back out. Megan screamed at him, demanding to know why the audio feed had suddenly died. She ordered him to explain if he had secured the deed to my cottage. Aaron looked at her with completely dead eyes. He told her he knew about the medical procedure she had hidden from him 4 years ago. He called her a monster who had exploited his dream of becoming a father just to steal a piece of real estate. He walked out the door, got into the only vehicle they had, and drove away into the night. Megan was left entirely stranded in a filthy motel room. She had absolutely no cash, her credit cards were completely frozen by a federal injunction, and the husband she had manipulated for years had finally abandoned her. The walls of her meticulously crafted reality closed in. Desperation and sheer panic consumed her mind. She realized she was facing imminent federal prison time for bank fraud and forgery, and she had zero leverage left to negotiate. She needed to destroy the evidence. She convinced herself that I kept the original property deeds, the forged loan documents, and the micro-recorder her arrogant father had foolishly left behind, stashed somewhere inside my cottage. In her manic, unhinged state, she believed that if she could simply steal those physical documents, she could somehow erase the financial crimes she had committed. Megan walked 3 miles through the freezing, damp night air. She trudged along the dark shoulder of the highway, her expensive designer shoes blistering her bare feet, her thin silk blouse offering absolutely no protection against the biting wind. By the time she reached the edge of my wooded property, it was exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. She crept through the thick trees, her usually pristine appearance completely ruined by mud and sweat. She bypassed the front door, knowing I always kept the deadbolts locked tight. Instead, she moved to the back of the house toward the large glass window of my home office. She bent down and picked up a heavy, jagged landscaping rock from my flower bed. Without a single second of hesitation, Megan hurled the heavy rock directly through the glass. The deafening sound of shattering glass pierced the silent night. Shards rained down onto the office floor. Megan clumsily climbed through the broken window frame. The jagged edges of the remaining glass sliced through her expensive coat and tore her skin, but she did not even flinch. She was completely fueled by raw adrenaline and a terrifying narcissistic rage. She landed heavily on the floor, breathing in ragged, frantic gasps. She did not care about being quiet anymore. She scrambled to her feet and lunged toward my heavy mahogany desk. She ripped the drawers open with violent force, pulling them entirely out of their tracks and hurling them onto the floor. She grabbed stacks of folders, financial records, and old mail, tearing through them like a starving animal looking for food. She threw papers into the air, screaming in frustration when she could not find the original deed to the cottage or the forged collateral loan paperwork. She grabbed my brass letter opener and used it to pry open a locked wooden filing cabinet in the corner of the room. She was panting heavily, her hair stuck to her face with sweat, muttering frantic curses under her breath. She destroyed my bookshelves, ripping hardcover novels from their places, convinced I had hidden a secret safe behind them. She overturned the furniture, completely trashing the office in her manic desperation. She was absolutely convinced that if she just tore the room down to its bare studs, she would find the evidence she needed to save herself from federal prison. She was acting like a rabid creature, completely disconnected from reality, entirely consumed by her own malicious greed and the suffocating terror of her impending downfall. As she violently ripped the final drawer from my desk and threw it across the room, the main overhead lights in the office snapped on with a loud, sharp click. Megan froze instantly. She dropped the handful of papers she was clutching and slowly turned around. I was sitting perfectly still in my high-backed leather armchair in the dark corner of the room. I was wearing my tailored velvet smoking jacket, casually holding a porcelain saucer and sipping a cup of hot Earl Grey tea. I did not look surprised, nor did I look frightened. I looked entirely bored. I took a slow sip of my tea and placed the cup down on the small side table. "You look terrible, Megan," I stated, my voice echoing with icy, calculated calmness. Megan stared at me, her eyes wide with shock, her chest heaving as she struggled to comprehend how I had been sitting there watching her the entire time. I raised my hand and simply pointed toward the ceiling. In all four corners of the office, small, discreet security cameras were flashing with solid red lights. They had captured every single second of her violent break-in in high-definition video and pristine audio. If you are looking for the original property deeds and the micro-recorder your father so graciously gifted me, they are currently sitting inside a highly secure, climate-controlled bank vault downtown, I informed her. They are guarded by Jonathan Pierce and a team of corporate security officers. You broke into my home and destroyed my office for absolutely nothing. Megan opened her mouth to scream at me, preparing to launch into another vile defensive tirade. But before she could utter a single syllable, the piercing wail of police sirens echoed through the quiet woods. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the trees outside, casting harsh, moving shadows through the shattered window. I had triggered the silent alarm the exact moment her foot touched my property line. I took another leisurely sip of my tea. "Add breaking and entering burglary and destruction of private property to your growing list of federal charges, Megan," I said coldly. The heavy front door of my cottage burst open. Several armed police officers flooded into the hallway, shouting strict commands. They stormed into the office, their flashlights blinding her. Megan was violently thrown against the wall, her hands wrenched behind her back and cold steel handcuffs snapped tightly around her wrists. I remained in my armchair watching with absolute profound satisfaction as she was dragged out of my home screaming uncontrollably into the cold night. The flashing lights of the police cruisers faded into the dark distance, taking my unhinged daughter-in-law with them. I assumed the cold reality of a jail cell and the impending federal charges would finally break her malicious spirit. I also firmly believed my son would use this golden opportunity to completely sever his ties to her and begin rebuilding his ruined life. I was entirely wrong. The sheer depth of Aaron's pathetic, miserable codependency was staggering. Less than 48 hours after Megan was booked and processed for felony burglary, Jonathan Pierce called me with a highly disturbing update. Aaron had not abandoned her. Despite learning she had ruthlessly faked a pregnancy to manipulate him and steal my home, his spine was completely non-existent. He had emptied his very last emergency reserve account, pawned his luxury watch, and borrowed money from incredibly shady payday lenders just to scrape together enough cash to pay her bail. He actually welcomed her back with open arms as she walked out of the precinct. Instead of fleeing the state or quietly preparing for their inevitable federal indictments, Megan immediately doubled down on her aggression. She twisted the narrative, convincing Aaron that they were the actual victims of my malicious, calculated cruelty. By the end of the week, a nervous process server arrived at my cottage. He handed me a wrinkled, poorly formatted legal envelope. Megan and Aaron had hired a cheap strip mall attorney who advertised his services on daytime television commercials. They were officially suing me for entrapment, severe emotional distress, and unlawful eviction. The lawsuit absurdly claimed that I had deliberately provoked Megan into breaking the window and that my financial freeze was an act of psychological torture designed to ruin a struggling young family. It was a completely frivolous, desperate maneuver. They were hoping I would simply settle out of court to avoid the hassle and embarrassment of a public trial. They wanted a quick, quiet payout so they could flee the jurisdiction before the bank fraud investigation caught up to them. I called Jonathan immediately. I told him we would not settle for a single dime, but we would agree to a preliminary mediation meeting. I wanted to look them in the eyes one more time. I wanted to watch their pathetic illusion of control completely shatter in the sterile environment of a corporate boardroom. The mediation took place on a rainy Tuesday morning in a neutral downtown office building. I arrived early wearing a simple, unassuming gray suit projecting the image of a quiet, retired man who was out of his depth. Jonathan Pierce sat beside me, radiating the absolute terrifying aura of a billion-dollar corporate assassin. His tailored suit cost more than the car Megan and Aaron drove. 10 minutes later, the heavy glass door opened. Megan and Aaron walked in, accompanied by their bargain basement attorney, a sweating, highly nervous man named Mr. Cobb. Cobb wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit and carried a scuffed leather briefcase. He swaggered into the room, clearly planning to aggressively bully a defenseless elderly man into writing a settlement check. He slammed his briefcase onto the polished table and opened his mouth to deliver his rehearsed, intimidating opening statement. Then his eyes landed directly on Jonathan Pierce. The blood instantly drained from Mr. Cobb's face. He recognized my representation immediately. Anyone who practiced law in this city knew Jonathan Pierce was a ruthless apex predator who dismantled multinational corporations for breakfast. Cobb began to stutter, his aggressive posture collapsing into absolute subservience in a matter of seconds. He fumbled through his disorganized notes, meekly suggesting that my actions had caused his clients undue financial hardship and emotional trauma. Jonathan did not even let him finish his sentence. Jonathan slid a massive, thick black binder across the polished mahogany table. It landed with a loud, heavy thud right in front of Mr. Cobb. Jonathan coldly stated that the binder contained undeniable timestamp security video evidence of the burglary-certified bank records proving the forged collateral loan and a legally obtained recording of an extortion threat from Megan's father. Jonathan informed Mr. Cobb that pursuing this frivolous lawsuit would result in immediate disbarment proceedings and retaliatory countersuits that would bankrupt the lawyer personally. Cobb began sweating profusely. He furiously flipped through the damning documents, whispering frantically to Aaron and Megan that they had blatantly lied to him about the strength of their case and the nature of their opponent. During this chaotic shuffle of legal paperwork, Jonathan executed a psychological trap we had carefully planned beforehand. He pulled a separate standalone document from his leather portfolio to verify a specific date. He placed it down on the table deliberately, leaving it slightly off-center and entirely exposed. It was a certified, fully audited financial statement of my personal holdings prepared by my wealth management firm. Megan, who had been glaring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred, instinctively glanced down at the paper. She could never resist snooping into other people's business. Her eyes scanned the official bank seals and the itemized lists of commercial properties, corporate bonds, and liquid assets. Then her gaze landed precisely on the bottom line. Net worth, $5.5 million. I watched her facial expression closely. Her breathing stopped entirely. The realization hit her physical body like a high-voltage shockwave. The man she had endlessly mocked for living in a tiny wooden cottage, the man she had called a broke, useless burden holding her husband back, was actually a multimillionaire. The massive wealth she had spent her entire adult life desperately chasing, faking, and destroying her own husband to obtain had been sitting right in front of her the entire time. She had insulted a man who could buy her entire existence with the stroke of a pen. The transformation was instantaneous and utterly repulsive to witness. The sheer intoxicating magnitude of my wealth completely rewired her brain in real time. Her simmering anger, her humiliated pride, and her furious hatred evaporated into thin air. They were immediately replaced by a blinding parasitic greed. I could practically see the math actively calculating behind her widened eyes. She realized that Aaron was no longer her ticket to the top. He was a broke, indebted liability holding her back from the real fortune sitting across the table. Her cheap lawyer was still stammering, trying to apologize to Jonathan, and desperately attempting to withdraw the lawsuit on the spot to save his own miserable career. Aaron was sitting beside her, staring at the table in complete defeat, clearly realizing that they were completely trapped with no way out. Megan did not care about the lawsuit anymore. She did not care about the broken window, the frozen bank accounts, or the impending criminal charges hanging over her head. She only cared about the $5.5 million printed in black ink on that certified document. She violently shoved her chair back. She reached out and physically pushed Aaron aside, striking him hard in the chest to get him out of her line of sight. Aaron stumbled in his chair, looking at his wife in total confusion and hurt. Megan ignored him completely. She leaned her upper body across the polished mediation table, invading my personal space. The vicious, condescending sneer she always wore was entirely gone. In its place was a sickeningly sweet, desperate, and conspiratorial expression. She looked directly into my eyes, her voice dropping into a low, frantic whisper meant only for me to hear. "Simon, I am so sorry. Aaron forced me to break into your cottage. He was the absolute mastermind behind the forged signature." Megan's hushed, venomous whisper hung in the sterile air of the mediation room. I looked into her wide, calculating eyes. The sheer speed of her betrayal was breathtaking. Less than a minute ago, she was preparing to sue me for emotional distress, acting the part of a victimized wife standing by her marginalized husband. Now, staring at a certified document that proved my net worth was $5.5 million, she was eagerly volunteering to serve that same husband to a federal judge on a silver platter. I did not recoil in disgust, though every fiber of my being wanted to. Instead, I leaned slightly forward, matching her conspiratorial posture. Aaron was sitting less than 2 feet away, frantically whispering to his sweating, incompetent lawyer. He was completely oblivious to the fact that his wife was currently negotiating the price of his freedom. I kept my voice incredibly low, ensuring the conversation remained strictly between the two of us. You are claiming Aaron orchestrated the entire forgery. I stated my tone perfectly neutral and devoid of judgment. That is a very bold accusation, Megan. Blaming him for the break-in is a convenient excuse to save your own skin, but you will need far more than empty words to impress me. I do not write checks based on whispered gossip. Megan nodded frantically. Her eyes darted between my face and the certified financial statement still resting on the polished mahogany table. She licked her lips, her greed making her physically desperate. "I can prove it, Simon," she hissed, her voice vibrating with a manic, feral urgency. He forced me to go along with the collateral loan. He was entirely out of control, desperate to look like a successful, wealthy businessman to his peers. I was just a terrified wife trying to keep my marriage together. He is the criminal, not me. I let a slow, terrifyingly cold smile form on my lips. I decided to give her the exact bait she was begging for. "If you can provide written, irrefutable proof that Aaron was the singular mastermind behind the bank fraud and the burglary, I will make you a one-time offer," I whispered. "Provide the evidence. Frame it perfectly. If your proof is strong enough to exonerate you and entirely condemn him, I will instruct my legal team to drop all civil charges against you. Furthermore, I will provide you with a highly generous severance package. I will initiate a 6-figure cash wire transfer to an offshore account of your choosing. You can start a brand new life completely free of your deadweight husband and his federal crimes." Her eyes dilated. The prospect of a massive, untraceable 6-figure payout completely blinded her to any remaining shred of human decency or legal caution. "I will have the proof to you by tonight," she promised without a single second of hesitation. I leaned back in my leather executive chair, slowly adjusting my gray suit jacket. I signaled to Jonathan Pierce with a brief, almost imperceptible nod. Jonathan immediately stood up, snapped his heavy leather portfolio shut, and coldly informed Mr. Cobb that the mediation session was officially terminated. We walked out of the glass boardroom without another word, leaving Aaron utterly confused by our abrupt departure and Megan vibrating with malicious, greedy anticipation. That night I sat in my home office. The shattered window from Megan's midnight burglary had been professionally boarded up and secured, leaving the room feeling like a fortified bunker. I sat at my heavy mahogany desk, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. Jonathan was on a secure conference call with me, silently monitoring our incoming legal correspondence through his firm's encrypted servers. We knew she would take the bait. A parasite cannot resist a fresh host, especially when the old host has been bled completely dry. At exactly 11:42, a notification chimed loudly through my computer speakers. A new email had arrived in my secure inbox. The sender was Megan. The subject line simply read, "Evidence." I opened the email and began to read. It was not a brief summary or a simple statement of shifting blame. It was a brutal, meticulous 3-page character assassination of my son. Megan had poured every ounce of her sociopathic intelligence into crafting a fictional narrative that completely absolved her of any wrongdoing while burying Aaron under a mountain of federal offenses. I read her words, quietly digesting the absolute moral bankruptcy of the woman my son had sacrificed his dignity to marry. She detailed Aaron's supposed financial incompetence, painting him as a desperate, emasculated man who was obsessed with projecting an image of generational wealth he did not actually possess. She claimed he was deeply intimidated by her entrepreneurial spirit and sought to aggressively control her by secretly funding her startup with illegal stolen money. According to her multi-page narrative, Aaron had independently hired the corrupt notary. She explicitly stated that Aaron had spent weeks practicing my signature at the kitchen island in their downtown apartment, forcing her to watch his criminal behavior in silent, abused terror. But she did not stop at simply telling a fabricated story. Megan knew I demanded irrefutable proof to authorize the 6-figure wire transfer, so she manufactured it. Attached to the email were several high-resolution screenshots of text messages and forwarded corporate emails. She had spent the last 10 hours painstakingly doctoring digital correspondence. She had altered timestamps and manipulated text threads to make it appear as though Aaron was actively threatening her life and her freedom. One fabricated text message, purportedly from Aaron, read, "Keep your mouth shut about the cottage loan or I will make sure you go down with me." Another doctored email showed Aaron allegedly instructing her to stay hidden in the cheap motel while he went to physically handle the problem at my property, effectively framing him as the sole instigator of the violent midnight break-in. She had even attached a fake timeline claiming Aaron had physically intimidated her into maintaining their aggressive legal stance during the mediation meeting that very morning. She was throwing the man who had just pawned his luxury watch and emptied his final emergency bank account to pay her bail straight into a federal incinerator. She happily traded his entire future for the promise of a cash payout. I read the final paragraph where she politely requested the wire transfer routing details and expressed her deep, profound relief at finally being free from Aaron's toxic criminal manipulation. Jonathan spoke through the speakerphone, his voice laced with intense professional disgust. "That is easily the most thoroughly documented act of marital treason I have ever seen in my entire legal career," Jonathan noted. "She just handed us everything we need to ensure she goes to federal prison for digital forgery, perjury, and obstruction of justice on top of the burglary and fraud charges. She has provided the rope to hang herself. Do we submit this directly to the district attorney tonight?" I stared at the glowing screen, reading the vile, fabricated text messages Megan had spent hours forging. I felt no triumph. I felt no joy in outsmarting her. I felt only a cold, clinical finality. My son had sacrificed his morals, his relationship with his father, and his own financial security for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a disposable human shield. He needed to understand the true devastating cost of his profound weakness. The legal system would eventually handle Megan, and Jonathan would personally ensure she served maximum time in a federal penitentiary. But Aaron did not need a courtroom right now. He needed a mirror. "No, Jonathan," I replied, my voice steady and completely void of mercy. "Do not send this to the district attorney yet. We are going to let the primary victim of this perjury review the evidence first." I did not type a single word of reply to Megan. I did not confirm the receipt of the email, nor did I acknowledge her desperate, greedy demand for the cash severance package. I left her sitting in that cheap, filthy motel room, staring at her phone and sweating in the dark, waiting for a payday that would never arrive. I moved my cursor to the top of her 3-page email. I clicked the forward button. I typed Aaron's personal cell phone number into the recipient line. I attached every single doctored screenshot, every fake text message, and the entire rambling essay where his wife systematically destroyed his character and framed him for her own federal crimes. I imagined Aaron sitting on the edge of a sagging motel bed, completely broke his future in ashes, still foolishly believing he and his wife were fighting this war together against a cruel father. I imagined his phone buzzing in the quiet, damp room. I imagined him opening the email and reading the exact price of his soul. Without a moment of hesitation, I pressed send and finalized his destruction. The read receipt notification pinged on my laptop screen exactly 4 minutes after I sent the email. Aaron had opened the message. I sat in the absolute quiet of my home office, leaning back in my leather chair, staring at the digital timestamp. I did not need to be in that cheap motel room to see the exact moment my son's entire reality shattered into a million jagged pieces. I could vividly imagine the scene. I could see him staring at the glowing screen of his smartphone, his tired, bloodshot eyes scanning the meticulously forged text messages and the vile 3-page essay his wife had written to condemn him to federal prison. The woman he had sacrificed his own father to protect had just sold him to the highest bidder without a single ounce of hesitation. 15 minutes of agonizing silence passed. Then my personal cell phone began to vibrate on the mahogany desk. I answered the call and brought the receiver to my ear. I did not speak. I simply waited. "Dad," Aaron gasped. His voice did not sound human. It was a hollow, mangled rasp, completely stripped of any remaining dignity or pride. He was choking on his own tears, struggling to pull enough oxygen into his lungs to form complete words. Did she really write this? Did she really offer to send me to prison for money? I kept my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any paternal warmth. "She did, Aaron. She read a certified financial document proving my net worth. The very second she realized you were no longer her most profitable asset, she shoved you aside and offered to frame you for the collateral loan forgery. She demanded a 6-figure offshore wire transfer in exchange for your freedom." A guttural, agonizing sob tore through the phone speaker. Aaron was physically breaking down. He had abandoned his morals, committed bank fraud, and participated in my attempted eviction, all under the delusion that he and his wife were an unbreakable team fighting for their survival. Now he was staring at the undeniable proof that he was nothing more than a disposable human shield. His loyalty had been entirely transactional, and his lease had just expired. He let out one final devastating cry of pure anguish and abruptly ended the call. The line went dead. I placed my phone back onto the desk and immediately opened the encrypted messaging application Jonathan Pierce had installed on my laptop. I was not blind to the danger of a cornered, emotionally destroyed man. I had instructed the private investigator to maintain a continuous, unbroken surveillance operation on the motel. I needed to know exactly how my son would process his ultimate destruction. The investigator began feeding me a steady stream of live clinical text updates that painted a vivid picture of a man rapidly spiraling into the abyss. According to the investigator's reports, Aaron stumbled out of the motel room less than 5 minutes after hanging up my call. He completely ignored the heavy freezing rain pouring down onto the concrete parking lot. He walked mechanically toward a brightly lit 24-hour convenience store adjacent to the motel property. He emerged moments later clutching a cheap plastic bottle of dark whiskey. The investigator sent a grainy, long lens photograph. Aaron was sitting alone on the wet concrete curb, his expensive suit soaked and ruined, drinking the cheap liquor straight from the bottle. He was actively consuming the poison of his own profound failure, desperately trying to numb the agonizing pain of his wife's betrayal. I sat in my warm, secure office watching the text messages roll in over the next hour. I felt no urge to intervene. A man who builds his house on a foundation of lies must eventually sit in the ruins when it inevitably collapses. The investigator noted that Aaron had consumed more than half the bottle in under 40 minutes. He finally stood up, his balance visibly compromised, swaying dangerously as he staggered back toward the motel room. The investigator moved his vehicle closer to capture the audio. A brief, muffled shouting match echoed through the thin, poorly insulated walls of the cheap motel. I could easily deduce what was happening inside. Aaron was confronting the traitor. He was likely screaming at Megan, demanding to know how she could be so heartless. Megan, cornered and exposed, likely responded with her trademark toxic aggression. 3 minutes later, the motel door violently swung open. Aaron stormed out, clutching the key fob to Megan's leased luxury sedan, a vehicle that was currently 2 months behind on its financing payments. He stumbled into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. The investigator immediately started his own engine, texting me that Aaron was highly intoxicated and preparing to drive. The luxury sedan peeled out of the motel parking lot, its tires screeching loudly against the wet asphalt. Aaron swerved onto the main interstate, pushing the heavy vehicle recklessly past the speed limit. The investigator trailed him at a safe distance, relaying the erratic, highly dangerous lane changes. Aaron was driving completely blind, with rage and alcohol running from a reality he could no longer face. The inevitable conclusion occurred less than 4 miles down the highway. The investigator's text messages briefly stopped. Then a single high-resolution photograph loaded onto my screen. It showed the silver luxury sedan wrapped violently around a thick steel streetlight on a sharp highway off-ramp. The front end of the vehicle was entirely crushed inward, the airbags were fully deployed, and thick gray smoke was billowing from the destroyed engine block. The investigator sent one final text. "The target has crashed. Police and paramedics are currently en route." The digital clock on my mahogany desk glowed brightly, marking exactly 3 o'clock in the morning. The quiet sanctuary of my home office was abruptly shattered by the harsh, demanding ringtone of my personal cell phone. I looked at the caller ID. It was not the private investigator, nor was it Jonathan Pierce. The screen displayed the official contact number for the downtown police precinct. I slowly picked up the device and answered the call, my voice steady and completely prepared for the inevitable fallout. "This is Simon," I stated simply. The officer on the other end identified himself as a desk sergeant from the traffic division. He spoke with the tired, mechanical cadence of a man who dealt with midnight tragedies on a regular basis. He informed me that my son Aaron was currently sitting in a holding cell at their facility. Aaron had been treated by paramedics at the scene of the collision for a severe laceration to his forehead and a mild concussion, but he was physically stable. However, the sergeant informed me that Aaron was facing incredibly severe felony charges. He had blown significantly over the legal blood alcohol limit at the crash site. He was being booked for driving under the influence and reckless endangerment of public property. Then the desk sergeant paused, shuffling a stack of paperwork on his end of the line. He revealed a third, far more devastating charge that instantly elevated the situation from a tragic mistake to a federal nightmare. Aaron was also being officially charged with grand theft auto. I frowned, fully aware that the vehicle technically belonged to his wife's corporate lease agreement. I asked the sergeant to clarify the stolen vehicle charge. The officer explained the sickening reality with cold, bureaucratic precision. Exactly 1 hour prior to the crash, the primary leaseholder, Megan, had called the emergency dispatch line. She had vindictively reported the vehicle stolen from the motel parking lot. She completely fabricated a malicious story, claiming that a highly aggressive, dangerous intruder had forced his way into her room and stolen her keys. She weaponized the police force against her own husband. She knew he was intoxicated and emotionally destroyed. Instead of attempting to stop him, she intentionally framed him for a massive felony to ensure he would be immediately arrested and thrown into a jail cell. She was actively clearing the board, removing Aaron from the equation entirely so she could freely pursue the severance package she so desperately craved. I thanked the sergeant for the information and ended the call. I sat in the darkness of my home office, the soft glow of the laptop screen illuminating the room. Aaron was currently sitting on a cold steel bench in a county holding cell facing multiple severe felony charges brought against him by his own vindictive wife. He was exactly where he needed to be. A jail cell is the ultimate equalizer, stripping away all illusions of grandeur and forcing a man to confront the absolute rock bottom of his own disastrous decisions. I felt no urge to post his bail. I felt no urge to hire a high-priced defense attorney to rescue him from his own incompetence. He needed to sit in that concrete room shivering in a thin uniform and truly digest the devastating cost of his profound weakness. With my son temporarily neutralized and securely removed from the playing field, I turned my attention back to the primary target. It was time to completely eradicate Thomas and his hollow manufacturing empire. I opened the encrypted communication channel to Jonathan Pierce. The message I sent was incredibly brief, consisting of a single uncompromising command to execute the foreclosure. Jonathan replied less than a minute later, confirming that the lethal legal machinery was already in motion. Through Cora Holdings, our anonymous shell corporation, we officially called in the entirety of Thomas's $4 million commercial debt. Thomas had severely violated 3 separate financial covenants by failing to maintain the required liquid capital reserves over the past 2 fiscal quarters. This gave us the absolute, undisputed legal right to demand immediate repayment of the principal loan balance in full. Thomas did not have $4 million. He barely had enough liquid cash to cover his elite country club membership dues and the luxury car leases he used to project his fake wealth. The trap I had carefully constructed had finally snapped completely shut. The financial guillotine was dropping at terminal velocity, and Thomas was entirely oblivious to the fact that his executioner was the same retired, unassuming black man he had aggressively threatened and racially degraded in my very own kitchen just a few days prior. The fallout was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic. By 9 o'clock that morning, a massive fleet of aggressive corporate liquidators accompanied by armed county sheriffs arrived simultaneously at every single property Thomas owned. They descended upon his sprawling regional furniture factory, marching straight into the executive suites with absolute authority. They completely bypassed his stunned receptionist and handed the terrified floor managers the emergency foreclosure documents. The liquidators immediately ordered the entire factory floor to shut down. Heavy padlocks and thick steel chains were secured onto the massive loading dock doors. Every single piece of heavy machinery, every delivery truck, and every item of raw inventory was officially seized and tagged as corporate property belonging to Cora Holdings. The humiliation did not stop at his business. Thomas had foolishly used his personal residential estate as secondary collateral to secure those massive commercial loans. While he was being physically escorted off his own factory floor by armed deputies, a secondary team of liquidators arrived at his multi-million-dollar suburban mansion. Linda was reportedly in the middle of hosting a lavish morning brunch for her wealthy socialite friends when the authorities knocked on her custom mahogany front doors. The sheriffs presented the eviction orders and gave her exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises entirely. The sheer unadulterated embarrassment of being thrown out of her own home in front of her judgmental, gossiping peers must have been an agonizing psychological death for a woman whose entire identity was built on projecting an image of untouchable superiority. They were stripped of their business, their luxury vehicles, and their home in a matter of hours. They had absolutely nowhere to go. Their credit lines were frozen. Their accounts were seized, and their wealthy friends suddenly stopped answering their frantic phone calls. When a predator loses its teeth, the rest of the pack immediately abandons it to starve in the wilderness. I knew exactly where they would eventually end up. They had run out of options, out of money, and out of pride. At 8 o'clock that evening, a massive thunderstorm rolled over the city, unleashing torrential rain across the region. The security cameras mounted around my property flashed a warning notification onto my tablet. A cheap, battered taxicab pulled into my muddy gravel driveway. It was a stark, humiliating contrast to the pristine silver Mercedes they had arrived in just days ago. Thomas and Linda stepped out of the taxi. They did not have an umbrella. The heavy rain instantly soaked through Thomas's wrinkled suit and plastered Linda's hair to her face. Their designer clothes were ruined, heavy with mud and water. They dragged their feet toward my front porch, looking like 2 beaten, miserable stray animals. The arrogance that had once radiated from their pores was entirely gone, replaced by a suffocating, undeniable desperation. Thomas raised his trembling fist and knocked on my front door. It was not the aggressive, demanding pound from his previous visit. It was a weak, pathetic tap. I let them stand in the freezing rain for a full 5 minutes, allowing the cold reality of their newfound poverty to seep deep into their bones. Finally, I unlocked the deadbolt and slowly opened the heavy door. I stood in the warm, dry entrance of my cottage, looking down at the 2 shivering people on my porch. Thomas fell to his knees, ignoring the thick mud soaking into his trousers. He looked up at me, rainwater streaming down his face, his eyes wide with absolute panic. "Simon," he gasped, his voice cracking with raw terror. "Please, you have to tell Cora Holdings to stop. They took everything. The factory is gone. They locked Linda out of the house. We have absolutely nothing left." I stared down at the man who had confidently threatened to have me locked in a state-run medical facility. He was kneeling in the mud on my property, begging for a mercy he had never once shown to anyone else in his entire miserable life. Linda stood behind him, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, shivering uncontrollably in the freezing downpour. She did not dare make eye contact with me. She kept her gaze fixed on the dirty wooden floorboards of my porch, utterly broken by the total collapse of her artificial kingdom. I did not invite them inside. I did not offer them a towel or a warm cup of tea to chase away the cold. I simply reached into the breast pocket of my tailored jacket and retrieved a small folded piece of paper. I slowly unfolded it, revealing the exact $20,000 personal check Thomas had aggressively slammed onto my kitchen table just a few days prior. He had tried to use this very piece of paper to buy my silence, to assert his racial and financial dominance, and to permanently subjugate my family. Now it was nothing more than a worthless symbol of his eradicated empire. I held the check out between 2 fingers. I let go. The piece of paper fluttered through the cold, damp air and landed directly in a muddy puddle right next to Thomas's trembling knee. The rain immediately began to wash over it, blurring his arrogant signature into an illegible blue smear. "Use this to rent a motel room," I commanded, my voice slicing through the heavy sound of the pouring rain with absolute unforgiving authority. "Assuming, of course, that your personal checking account has not already been completely frozen by the corporate liquidators." Thomas stared at the ruined check in the mud, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single coherent sound. The devastating reality of his complete destruction was finally setting in, but I was not finished. I leaned slightly forward, ensuring my next words would be permanently burned into his memory. "Enjoy your night in a cheap motel," Thomas, I stated coldly, "because tomorrow morning I am handing the extortion tape directly to the district attorney. You have exactly 12 hours of freedom left before the federal arrest warrants are issued." I stepped back, closed my heavy oak door, and slid the deadbolt firmly into place, leaving them outside in the dark and the freezing rain. The morning sun offered no warmth as it filtered through the high barred windows of the downtown police precinct. I sat quietly in the adjacent observation room with Jonathan Pierce sipping a cup of bitter precinct coffee. Through the one-way mirror, the bleak reality of the interrogation room was on full display. Megan had been brought up from the holding cells wearing a drab, oversized orange jumpsuit that completely swallowed her frame. Her blonde hair was a greasy, tangled mess, and the arrogant sneer she usually wore had been entirely scrubbed from her face. 10 minutes later, the heavy metal door swung open. 2 uniformed officers escorted Thomas and Linda into the room. They looked absolutely wretched. Their damp, wrinkled clothes smelled of the cheap, mildewed motel they had been forced to sleep in after I threw them off my property. They sat down at the cold steel table, shivering and terrified. Detective Miller, a seasoned veteran who had absolutely no patience for entitled criminals, walked into the room carrying a thick manila folder. He did not offer them coffee or small talk. He dropped the folder onto the metal table with a loud smack that made Linda physically jump in her seat. He pulled out the forged home equity loan documents, the bank transfer receipts showing the stolen funds moving into Megan's startup, and the digital logs of her frantic attempt to break into my cottage. Then he placed a small digital audio player right in the center of the table. He pressed the play button. My kitchen conversation with Thomas echoed loudly off the concrete walls. Thomas heard his own booming, racially charged voice threatening to bury my son and have me locked in a state-run medical facility. He heard himself explicitly admit that he knew Megan had forged the signature and that he fully supported her federal crime. The color drained completely from Thomas's face. He stared at the audio player as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Linda covered her mouth with both hands, tears welling in her eyes as she realized the sheer magnitude of the prison time hanging over their heads. Detective Miller leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the steel table. He coldly informed them that they were facing a mountain of federal and state charges, including extortion, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, burglary, and elder abuse. The trap was fully sprung, and there was absolutely no way out. The suffocating silence in the interrogation room lasted for exactly 10 seconds before the illusion of their tight-knit, wealthy family violently imploded. The survival instinct of a cornered predator always overrides any lingering sense of loyalty. Megan was the very first to strike. She slammed her handcuffed wrists onto the metal table, pointing a shaking finger directly at her father. She screamed that Thomas was the absolute mastermind behind the entire financial scheme. She frantically told Detective Miller that her father had aggressively pressured her to secure that illegal collateral loan. She claimed Thomas was drowning in millions of dollars of toxic commercial debt and needed her to funnel the stolen cash through her startup directly into his failing furniture manufacturing business. She painted herself as a terrified, abused daughter who had been heavily manipulated by a tyrannical, domineering father. She insisted she only broke into my cottage because Thomas had threatened to cut her off entirely if she did not retrieve the micro-recorder. Thomas erupted in a geyser of pure, unadulterated fury. His face turned a dangerous mottled shade of purple. He lunged across the steel table, completely ignoring the presence of the armed police officers standing right behind him. He screamed that Megan was a greedy, spoiled parasite who had single-handedly destroyed his entire legacy. He aggressively denied forcing her to do anything, stating that she was a pathetic failure who had burned through her investors' cash just to buy designer handbags and host lavish corporate parties. He told the detective that Megan had come to him begging for help after she had already committed the forgery, and that he had only stepped in to protect his family name from her monumental stupidity. He cursed her, calling her a worthless mistake who had dragged her own parents into a federal nightmare simply because she refused to live within her means. Linda sat between them, sobbing uncontrollably as she watched her husband and her daughter viciously tear each other to shreds. The pristine, upper-crust family image she had spent decades curating at elite country clubs was burning to the ground in a dirty police precinct. Megan did not back down. She yelled over her father's booming voice, begging Detective Miller for a plea deal. She offered to wear a wire, testify against her father in open court, and provide full access to Thomas's hidden offshore accounts in exchange for full immunity. Thomas immediately countered her offer. He shouted that he would hand over every single piece of evidence regarding Megan's fraudulent startup practices and explicitly testify that she had planned to slowly poison my medication to gain control of my estate, a shocking revelation that even I had not anticipated. They were ruthlessly cannibalizing each other. Every shred of parental love and filial devotion was completely eradicated by their desperate need to avoid a prison cell. They threw wild accusations, exposed deeply buried family secrets, and offered to completely destroy one another for the slight chance of a reduced sentence. Detective Miller simply leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms and watching the carnage unfold with a look of mild disgust. He did not even need to interrogate them. They were doing all of the heavy lifting for him, eagerly providing enough probable cause to secure search warrants for every single property and bank account they had ever touched. I watched through the one-way mirror, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure. The monsters were finally consuming themselves. The vicious screaming match inside the interrogation room was abruptly cut short when the heavy steel door swung open once again. The sudden interruption caused Thomas and Megan to snap their mouths shut, breathing heavily as they glared at the new arrival. It was Jonathan Pierce. He walked into the hostile environment with the smooth, terrifying confidence of a man who owned the entire building. He did not look at Thomas. He did not look at Megan. He walked directly up to Detective Miller and handed him a crisp, freshly printed legal document housed inside a blue backing folder. Jonathan adjusted his expensive silk tie and turned to face the broken family sitting at the table. He coldly announced that the document he had just delivered was a fully executed, heavily binding cooperation agreement signed directly from the county jail. He informed them that he had spent the last 2 hours sitting in a cold holding cell with my son. Aaron had finally reached his absolute breaking point, After reading the vile fabricated email where Megan had attempted to frame him for every single one of her federal crimes, Aaron had completely surrendered. He had officially agreed to turn state's evidence. Jonathan revealed that Aaron had provided the district attorney with full unrestricted access to all of his personal devices, cloud storage accounts, and encrypted messaging applications. He had surrendered every single text message, every voice note, and every digital receipt detailing Megan's meticulous planning of the forgery and the burglary. More importantly, Aaron had provided detailed documented proof of Thomas's active involvement in the cover-up and his explicit attempts to launder the stolen funds through his failing manufacturing company. Aaron had completely waived his right to a trial and agreed to stand on the witness stand in open court to testify against his wife and his father-in-law. Jonathan looked directly into Megan's terrified eyes and delivered the final crushing blow. He informed her that the district attorney no longer needed her testimony, nor did they need a plea deal from Thomas. Aaron had already given them everything they needed to secure maximum federal prison sentences for both of them. The leverage they thought they possessed was entirely gone. Jonathan turned on his heel and walked out of the interrogation room, leaving them to marinate in the absolute certainty of their impending destruction. The federal courthouse was a fortress of polished oak and cold marble, a fitting arena for the absolute destruction of Thomas and his daughter. The trial moved with the terrifying, unrelenting speed of a heavily fortified avalanche. The prosecution did not need to rely on theatrical courtroom tactics because the evidence they presented was entirely suffocating. They played the crystal-clear audio recording of Thomas aggressively threatening me in my own kitchen. His racial slurs and extortionate demands echoed loudly through the silent, packed gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads as the myth of the respectable regional furniture tycoon was brutally dismantled in real time. Then came the forensic financial trail. Expert accountants projected massive spreadsheets onto the courtroom screens, tracing the exact path of the forged $150,000 collateral loan. They showed how the stolen funds were illegally laundered through Megan's failing startup directly into Thomas's heavily leveraged, bankrupt manufacturing accounts. Every digital receipt, every time-stamped text message, and every offshore wire transfer attempt was laid bare for the jury to examine. The defense attorneys for Thomas and Megan tried to object, but they were repeatedly shut down by the judge, who had absolutely no patience for their baseless technicalities. Thomas sat at the defense table, his massive frame shrinking with every passing hour. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, unable to look at the gallery where his former country club peers and business associates sat whispering in profound disgust. The prosecution systematically stripped away his entire identity. He was exposed not as a titan of industry, but as a desperate, pathetic fraud who had actively conspired to steal from a widowed, elderly black man just to keep up appearances. By the time Aaron took the stand as the state's star witness, calmly reading the vicious doctored emails Megan had used to frame him, Thomas's public reputation was completely and utterly annihilated. There would be no recovery, no comeback tour, and no social redemption for him. He was officially a convicted felon and a social pariah. Despite the insurmountable mountain of evidence, Megan's defense attorney made the baffling, desperate decision to put her on the witness stand. She walked up to the wooden podium wearing a simple conservative beige dress, completely devoid of her usual heavy makeup and expensive designer jewelry. She was actively attempting to project the image of a naive, battered woman who had been hopelessly manipulated by the powerful, domineering men in her life. She looked at the jury box and immediately began to cry. It was a highly calculated, meticulously rehearsed performance. She sobbed quietly into a tissue, claiming that Aaron had emotionally abused her into compliance, and that her father had forced her to handle the illegal financial transfers. She swore she was completely terrified of both of them, and that her midnight break-in at my cottage was a frantic, misguided attempt to find evidence to clear her own name. She begged the jury for mercy, utilizing every single ounce of her manipulative charm to paint herself as the ultimate victim of circumstance. I sat in the very first row of the gallery, located less than 15 feet away from the witness stand. I did not blink. I did not shift in my seat. I kept my posture perfectly rigid, my hands resting calmly on the wooden railing in front of me. I locked my eyes directly onto hers, maintaining a cold, piercing, and entirely unforgiving stare. Whenever she paused her fake sobbing to gauge the jury's reaction, her eyes inevitably darted toward the gallery and she found me waiting. I channeled every ounce of my absolute disdain into that single look. I was the man she had called a useless, broke burden. I was the man she had tried to evict with a 24-hour notice. Now I was the man holding the leash to her entire future. The psychological pressure of my silent, unyielding gaze began to crack her carefully constructed facade. She stumbled over her rehearsed lines. Her fake tears dried up rapidly, replaced by a genuine frantic panic. Her defense attorney asked her to clarify her actions on the night of the burglary, but she could not concentrate. She kept looking at me, her chest heaving as the sheer suffocating weight of my silent judgment pressed down on her lungs. I offered her no physical reaction, just the steady, predatory stare of a man who had completely defeated her. She began to sweat, wiping her forehead with a trembling hand as the prosecuting attorney stepped up for cross-examination. The prosecutor relentlessly grilled her on the fake pregnancy and the doctored emails she had sent me, cornering her in a maze of her own documented lies. Finally, the tension reached a critical, explosive threshold. Megan abruptly stopped speaking mid-sentence. She gripped the edges of the wooden witness stand, her knuckles turning bone white. The polite, victimized persona vanished entirely, completely consumed by her raw, narcissistic rage. She pointed a shaking finger directly at me in the front row. "Stop looking at me like that!" she shrieked, her voice echoing violently through the high-ceilinged courtroom. She ignored the immediate harsh warnings from the presiding judge and continued her unhinged outburst. "You did this to me. You set me up. You hid your filthy millions in that rotting shack just to humiliate us. You are a vindictive, malicious old man, and you deserve to die alone." The entire courtroom erupted in loud, shocked gasps. The bailiff stepped forward, but Megan was entirely out of control, revealing her true, incredibly toxic nature to the exact jury she was just begging for mercy. She screamed that she was entitled to the money, that her startup was more important than my peaceful retirement, and that my entire existence was a joke. Her attorney buried his face in his hands. She had just handed the prosecution the final nail for her own coffin. The judge slammed his heavy wooden gavel, repeatedly demanding order in the court, as the bailiffs physically restrained Megan and forced her back into her seat at the defense table. Her catastrophic outburst had single-handedly destroyed whatever microscopic shred of sympathy her attorney had managed to manufacture. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. It was one of the fastest verdicts in the history of the county courthouse. When the foreman read the decisions, the word guilty rang out consecutively for every single felony charge brought against Thomas and Megan. The judge did not waste any time scheduling a separate sentencing hearing. The severity of the crimes and the overwhelming lack of remorse warranted immediate judicial action. He looked down at Thomas with absolute disgust. For extortion, accessory to bank fraud, and elder abuse, the judge sentenced Thomas to 3 years in a federal penitentiary, followed by steep financial restitution to the court. Thomas hung his head silently, accepting the final consequences of his monumental arrogance. The judge then turned his attention to Megan. For federal bank fraud, digital forgery, felony burglary, and perjury, he sentenced her to 5 full years in a federal correctional facility. Megan collapsed into her chair, sobbing hysterically as a female officer moved in to apply the heavy metal handcuffs to her wrists. She looked wildly around the room for someone to save her, but found only the cold stares of the people she had tried to manipulate. With the primary conspirators officially sentenced, the courtroom fell into a heavy, expectant silence. The judge adjusted his glasses and looked over his remaining case files. He then turned his stern gaze toward the prosecution table, where Aaron sat quietly in a standard county jail uniform. Aaron had already pled guilty to his involvement, waiving his right to a trial in exchange for his full cooperation with the state investigators. He had done exactly what he promised, but he still had to face the ultimate judgment for his profound weakness and betrayal. The judge folded his hands and looked directly past the defense tables, locking eyes with me in the front row of the gallery. "Mr. Simon," the judge stated, his voice echoing clearly across the silent room. "Your son has fully cooperated with the state, but his crimes against you are still exceptionally severe. Before I hand down his final sentence, the court wishes to hear from the primary victim. I invite you to take the stand and speak on your son's behalf for his sentencing." I stood up from the heavy oak bench in the front row. The eyes of every reporter, lawyer, and spectator in the gallery tracked my movements as I walked slowly toward the wooden witness stand. I did not rush. I placed my hands on the polished railing and looked up at the judge. Then I turned my head to look directly at Aaron. My son sat at the prosecution table wearing the drab uniform of a county inmate, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat. The courtroom held its collective breath, likely expecting a grieving father to beg the court for leniency, to cry for his boy, to plead for a total dismissal of the charges based on his cooperation. They expected a rescue. They did not know me at all. Your Honor, I began, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. My son committed a federal crime against me. He forged my signature, leveraged my home, and stood silently by while his wife attempted to destroy my mind and my dignity. He did this because he is a coward. He did this because I spent my entire life shielding him from the harsh, unforgiving realities of the world. I provided him with a financial safety net so thick that he completely forgot how to stand on his own 2 feet. If you send him to a federal prison today, he will simply exist in a cage. He will learn nothing about the actual value of a dollar, the dignity of hard work, or the consequences of entitlement. Prison is an easy escape for a man who has spent his entire adult life avoiding responsibility. I took a deep breath, keeping my gaze locked on Aaron. I am not asking for his freedom, I stated firmly. I am asking for his rehabilitation through grueling, undeniable labor. I ask the court to impose a strict, uncompromising 5-year suspended sentence. I request that he be placed under maximum supervisory probation. Furthermore, I demand that his sentence require thousands of hours of intense mandatory manual community service. He needs to clean the streets, scrub the city sanitation facilities, and perform the exhausting physical labor he spent his corporate life looking down upon. If he violates a single term of this probation, if he misses 1 hour of his labor, I ask that you immediately execute the suspended sentence and send him to a penitentiary. He needs to build character through sweat, Your Honor, not sit idle in a cell. The judge absorbed my words with a slow, contemplative nod. He did not immediately consult his legal notes. Instead, he turned his stern, evaluating gaze directly toward the prosecution table. Aaron, the judge, addressed my son, his voice echoing with judicial authority. You have heard the victim's request. It is a highly unorthodox proposal for crimes of this magnitude despite your cooperation with the state investigators. Your father is asking the court to show you a brutal, unforgiving form of mercy. Do you have anything to say before I render my final decision? Aaron slowly stood up from his chair. The heavy metal chains around his wrists clinked softly in the quiet courtroom. He did not look at his defense attorney for guidance. He did not look at the judge. He turned his entire body to face me directly. His eyes were completely bloodshot, swimming in unshed tears. But for the very first time in his adult life, he did not try to deflect the blame. He did not mention Megan's toxic manipulation. He did not mention the fake pregnancy or the intense financial pressure of his failing lifestyle. He simply looked at the father he had betrayed. Tears began to spill over his eyelashes, cutting clean tracks down his pale, exhausted face. Dad, Aaron said, his voice breaking under the crushing weight of his own profound guilt. You are completely right. I am a coward. I stood in your kitchen and let a monster insult you. I stole from you because I was too weak to admit that my life was a complete and utter failure. I wanted the image of success so badly that I sacrificed the only person in the world who actually loved me unconditionally. You gave me absolutely everything, and I threw it all away for an illusion. He paused, taking a ragged, shaky breath, desperately trying to maintain his composure. He finally turned to look up at the judge's bench. Your Honor, Aaron stated, his voice finding a small, unfamiliar reserve of strength. I completely accept my father's proposal. I do not want an easy way out. I do not deserve to sit in a cell while my father picks up the pieces of the life I actively tried to destroy. I deserve the probation. I deserve the grueling labor. If you order me to scrub the city streets for the next 5 years, I will do it without a single word of complaint. I want to pay for my crimes with my own 2 hands. I want to earn back my basic human dignity, even if I can never earn back my father's trust. I plead fully to the court, and I accept the absolute maximum punishment of the terms my father has laid out. The gallery remained entirely silent. Even the cynical, hardened reporters in the back row stopped scribbling in their notepads. It was a rare, raw display of absolute accountability. The judge leaned back in his leather chair, clearly moved by the stark contrast between Megan's frantic, narcissistic screaming match and Aaron's quiet, devastating surrender. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. Aaron, he announced, his voice carrying the finality of the law. Based on your full cooperation with the federal authorities and taking into heavy consideration the explicit specific requests of the primary victim, I am sentencing you to 5 years of maximum supervisory probation. This sentence carries a suspended 5-year federal prison term. Furthermore, you are hereby ordered to complete 4,000 hours of state-directed manual community service. If you fail to report for a single shift, or if you violate any term of your probation, You will serve the full 5 years in a federal facility. Court is adjourned. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed like a gunshot, finalizing the legal warfare that had consumed my life for the past month. I did not wait to watch the bailiffs escort Aaron out of the courtroom. I turned on my heel and walked straight down the center aisle, pushing through the heavy wooden double doors and stepping out into the bright marble-lined corridor of the courthouse. The air outside the courtroom felt significantly lighter. The toxic parasites that had tried to drain my existence were officially locked away or bound to years of miserable, back-breaking labor. I walked toward the massive glass windows overlooking the city square, feeling a deep, profound sense of closure. Jonathan Pierce was already waiting for me near the elevators. He stood perfectly straight, holding a sleek black leather portfolio under his arm. He did not offer me a congratulatory smile or any hollow words of comfort. He knew exactly what this victory had cost me emotionally. He opened the portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of pristine legal documents. He handed me a solid gold fountain pen. "The criminal proceedings are completely finalized," Simon Jonathan stated, his tone purely transactional and strictly professional. "The district attorney is satisfied, and the asset recovery from Thomas's bankrupt estate is currently proceeding without any judicial interference. Now we must execute the final domestic directive you requested yesterday afternoon." I took the gold pen and looked down at the documents resting on his leather portfolio. It was a completely revised, legally bulletproof draft of my last will and testament. I had spent 45 years building a real estate empire, quietly amassing a net worth of $5.5 million. I had originally intended to leave every single penny of it to Aaron, hoping it would secure his future long after I was gone. Instead, that wealth had almost cost me my freedom and my sanity. I did not hesitate for a single second. I pressed the nib of the pen to the thick paper and signed my name on the dotted line with smooth, unwavering precision. With a few strokes of ink, the documents were permanently sealed. Aaron was officially and entirely removed from my estate. He would not receive a single dime of the $5.5 million. My son was finally completely on his own. Exactly 1 year passed since the heavy wooden doors of the federal courthouse swung shut on the parasitic elements of my former family. Time is a ruthless equalizer. It strips away all the carefully constructed facades of wealth, privilege, and entitlement, leaving only the bare, unvarnished truth of a person's character. Inside the sterile, unforgiving concrete walls of the State Federal Women's Correctional Facility, the brutal reality of a 5-year sentence had completely broken my former daughter-in-law. Megan was no longer the manicured, arrogant socialite who wore designer trench coats and aggressively threw eviction notices onto my dining table. Her expensive blonde highlights had grown out into dull, uneven brown roots. She wore a shapeless, faded orange jumpsuit that offered absolutely no insulation against the perpetual damp chill of the prison laundry block. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly overhead as she knelt heavily on the wet tile floor. She gripped a cheap plastic brush with frayed bristles, aggressively scrubbing the deeply stained porcelain rim of a communal toilet. The sharp, toxic smell of industrial bleach and raw sewage clung permanently to her skin. She had initially tried to leverage her previous corporate status to secure an easier administrative job in the prison library, but her extensive federal fraud and forgery convictions immediately disqualified her from any position requiring trust or access to computers. She was permanently assigned to the lowest, most physically grueling manual labor available. Her hands, once adorned with expensive diamond rings funded entirely by my stolen money, were now cracked, bleeding, and constantly wrapped in cheap, torn rubber gloves. There were no wealthy investors to manipulate here. There were no country club neighbors to impress with fake success. The other inmates despised her entitled attitude and frequently targeted her, forcing her to trade her meager commissary rations just to ensure her physical safety. There was only the daily soul-crushing routine of exhausting labor, terrible food, and the suffocating realization that she had deliberately traded a comfortable, fully subsidized life for a concrete cage. Every single time she scrubbed the grime from those bathroom floors, she was forced to remember the $5.5 million fortune she had arrogantly thrown away. Her parents were faring absolutely no better on the outside. Thomas had managed to secure a compassionate medical release from his own federal sentence after suffering a severe stress-induced cardiac event in his holding cell. But his freedom was merely a different, far more humiliating type of prison. My corporate liquidators had been absolutely merciless. We aggressively seized every single factory, every piece of manufacturing equipment, and every luxury vehicle attached to his toxic commercial debt. The regional bank completely foreclosed on their sprawling suburban mansion, formally evicting them into the street with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a massive mountain of unresolved legal restitution fees. Thomas and Linda currently resided in a rusted, decades-old mobile home situated in a neglected high-crime trailer park on the far industrial outskirts of the city. The thin aluminum walls of their cramped trailer offered zero protection from the sweltering summer heat or the bitter winter winds. Thomas, the arrogant man who used to boast about moving millions of dollars every quarter and playing golf with judges, now spent his miserable days sitting in a cheap plastic lawn chair on a patch of dead grass staring blankly at the highway traffic. His regional furniture empire was a forgotten memory. His former wealthy friends completely ignored his desperate phone calls, treating him like a highly contagious disease. Linda had been forced to take a minimum wage job working the graveyard shift as a cashier at a local discount grocery store just to afford their basic electricity and Thomas's expensive heart medication. They were utterly bankrupted, socially annihilated, and completely trapped in the crushing cycle of poverty they used to so openly mock. I felt absolutely no guilt. I had simply allowed their own malicious greed to dictate their fate. While Thomas and Megan drowned in the toxic consequences of their own unbridled arrogance, my son was serving his severe sentence in a completely different manner. Aaron had pleaded guilty and accepted the grueling terms of his maximum supervisory probation without a single word of complaint or resistance. He was officially stripped of his fake project management title, his luxury leased vehicles, and his downtown apartment. It was nearly midnight on a cold Tuesday evening. I stood quietly in the shadows of the executive glass walkway on the 50th floor of the Apex Commercial Tower, one of the primary high-rise corporate buildings fully owned and operated by Cora Holdings. I looked down through the sprawling, modern interior atrium. 3 floors below my vantage point, Aaron was methodically working his way through a massive open-plan office space. He was no longer wearing a tailored designer suit or an expensive silk tie. He wore a dark blue, heavy canvas janitorial uniform with his first name stitched onto a simple, faded white patch over his chest. He leaned his body weight forward, pushing a large, heavy plastic utility cart loaded with industrial cleaning supplies, wet mop buckets, and thick black trash bags. His physical appearance had drastically changed over the past year. He had completely lost the soft, pampered weight of a man who spent his days pretending to be important behind a desk. His shoulders were visibly broader, his arms corded with lean, dense muscle built entirely through thousands of hours of exhausting, state-mandated manual labor. I watched him approach a large cluster of empty corporate cubicles. He bent down, hoisted a heavy trash bin filled with discarded paperwork and food wrappers, and emptied it directly into his cart. He sprayed harsh chemical disinfectant onto the desks and wiped them down with rapid, practiced efficiency. He did not look at his phone. He did not check a luxury watch. He did not complain about the menial nature of the work. He simply kept his head down and focused entirely on the rigorous physical task in front of him. Aaron was currently earning an honest state minimum wage. His entire weekly paycheck was heavily garnished by the county probation office to cover his outstanding court fees, his legal restitution, and his basic living expenses in a tiny, bare-bones studio apartment on the industrial south side of the city. He had absolutely zero disposable income. Yet, as he paused his labor to wipe the heavy sweat from his forehead with the back of his canvas sleeve, he briefly looked up toward the glowing city lights shining through the office windows. I pulled a small pair of high-powered theater binoculars from my jacket pocket to observe his face closely. The frantic, terrified desperation that used to permanently haunt his eyes during his toxic marriage to Megan was completely gone. The agonizing, suffocating pressure of constantly maintaining a fraudulent, wealthy lifestyle had been entirely lifted from his shoulders. He looked incredibly physically exhausted, his posture reflecting the sheer weight of a 12-hour manual shift. But his eyes were clear, steady, and profoundly peaceful. He had finally stopped running from reality. He had stopped trying to cheat his way to the top by stepping on the back of his own father. He was earning his daily bread through the undeniable grinding effort of his own 2 hands, repairing his fractured soul, 1 empty trash can and 1 mopped floor at a time. I stood perfectly still on the executive floor, completely hidden from his view in the darkness. I did not call his name. I did not walk down the stairs to offer him a word of encouragement or a secret financial handout. That would completely ruin the vital, necessary process of his rehabilitation. True character can never be purchased with a trust fund. It must be forged in the intense, unforgiving fire of personal accountability and relentless hard work. I lowered the binoculars and placed my hands firmly on the cool glass railing. For the first time in over a decade, I felt a deep, genuine sense of paternal pride for the man my son was slowly fighting to become. I gave a single silent nod of absolute approval to the empty executive hallway. He was paying his heavy debts to society and to himself exactly as I had demanded. I turned on my heel and walked toward the private elevator, leaving him to finish his midnight shift in absolute peace. I left the gleaming downtown district behind, steering my vehicle away from the towering commercial high-rises and back toward the quiet, heavily wooded outskirts of the city. The midnight air was crisp and entirely clear. When my tires finally crunched onto the familiar gravel of my driveway, the property that greeted me was vastly different from the one I had occupied just a year ago. It was no longer the quiet, unassuming wooden structure that my former daughter-in-law had so viciously mocked as a rotting shack. The original framework of the cottage remained entirely intact, preserving the sacred walls where my late wife Cora and I had shared our absolute best years. However, the surrounding acreage had undergone a massive multi-million-dollar transformation. I parked my vehicle and walked toward the entrance. A beautifully illuminated bronze plaque was mounted securely next to the heavy oak front door. The engraved letters read, "The Cora Foundation for Domestic Financial Resilience." Megan had aggressively demanded that I pack my bags and move to a miserable state-run nursing home so she could rent this exact property out to wealthy college students for a quick $3,000 monthly profit. Instead, I had utilized my vast resources to convert my home into a highly fortified, fully funded philanthropic headquarters. The property had been professionally expanded to include a sprawling state-of-the-art administrative annex cleverly hidden behind the original tree line. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The interior of the cottage had been beautifully restored. The dining room where Megan had arrogantly slapped that fraudulent eviction notice onto my oak table was now the central reception area. During the day, this space was bustling with intense, purposeful activity. I had personally hired a formidable team of expert financial analysts, aggressive defense attorneys, and specialized social workers. Their singular, uncompromising mission was to provide immediate, overwhelming legal and financial intervention for elderly and vulnerable individuals who were actively being exploited, defrauded, or abused by their own greedy family members. We offered emergency sanctuary housing and secure private residential properties I had purchased across the city. We provided ruthless legal representation to freeze stolen assets, reverse fraudulent property transfers, and prosecute abusive children to the absolute fullest extent of the law. Jonathan Pierce oversaw the legal division of the foundation on a strict pro bono basis, unleashing his terrifying corporate litigation tactics against any predatory relative foolish enough to try and steal a pension or forge a deed. Just last week, my team had successfully intercepted a predatory son who had secretly transferred his 80-year-old mother's entire life savings into a volatile cryptocurrency account. We froze his assets, recovered every single stolen penny, and handed the son directly over to federal prosecutors. I walked through the quiet, darkened hallways of the foundation, running my hand along the polished oak walls. The space felt incredibly warm and intensely alive. I had taken the very worst, most agonizing betrayal of my entire life and weaponized it into a shield for those who could not defend themselves. I had ensured that the profound cruelty Megan and Aaron had inflicted upon me would never be the defining chapter of my legacy. I poured myself a cup of hot Earl Grey tea in the staff kitchen and made my way to the expansive back porch. I sat down in my favorite heavy wooden rocking chair. The night was profoundly peaceful. There were no frantic phone calls demanding emergency cash injections. There were no manipulative, heavily orchestrated family dinners designed to extract my wealth. There was only the gentle rustle of the wind moving through the ancient pine trees. I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest as I looked out into the absolute darkness of the woods. I thought about the painful, necessary destruction of my family tree. I thought about Thomas and Linda shivering in their dilapidated trailer park. I thought about Megan scrubbing concrete floors in a federal penitentiary. And I thought about Aaron pushing a heavy janitorial cart through the midnight shadows of my commercial building, earning his redemption one agonizing hour at a time. The journey had been devastating, but it had granted me absolute clarity. People place a massive, entirely unwarranted amount of faith in the concept of family. They blindly assume that sharing genetic material automatically guarantees love, respect, and protection. It is a dangerous, incredibly toxic illusion. Blood does not make you family. Loyalty does. True family is defined by the people who stand by you when you have absolutely nothing to offer them but your presence. True family does not calculate your net worth before deciding how much respect you deserve. I had spent decades wearing cheap clothes and driving a beat-up truck because I wanted to protect my son from the corrosive nature of unearned wealth. I had believed that hiding my money was the only way to preserve his character. I was wrong. Money is not a corrupting disease. Money is just a mirror that reflects who you truly are. It is a magnifying glass that exposes the absolute core of your morality. When Megan and Aaron believed I was a broke, useless burden, their reflection showed pure, unadulterated cruelty and ruthless entitlement. When Megan accidentally discovered I was a multimillionaire, her reflection instantly morphed into a parasitic, betraying monster willing to sell her own husband to a federal judge for a cash payout. The money did not change them. It merely stripped away their polite masks and revealed the rotting predators lurking underneath. I leaned back in my chair, looking up at the bright, clear stars shining over the tree canopy. I had protected my peace. I had established my boundaries with lethal precision. I was 69 years old, and I was finally living completely surrounded by truth. I raised my teacup in a silent, solitary toast to Cora, knowing her name was now a permanent beacon of absolute justice for those fighting in the dark. And now I turn the question over to you. What would you do if your own family tried to throw you on the street for a quick buck? Would you walk away in silence, or would you use every resource at your disposal to fight back and teach them a permanent lesson? Let me know in the comments below. Sharing your own experiences might just help someone else who is currently fighting a similar battle. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories where the truth always wins. Thank you for listening, stay vigilant, and always remember to protect your peace. Another profound truth I learned is the hidden danger of overprotecting the people we love. For decades, I believed that providing a seamless financial safety net was the ultimate act of parental devotion. In reality, I was slowly suffocating my son's ability to develop resilience, character, and moral courage. When you shield a tree from every single storm, its roots never grow deep enough to anchor it securely in the soil. True love sometimes requires stepping back and allowing those we care about to face the harsh, unvarnished consequences of their own actions, because growth only happens in the struggle. If you have ever had to enforce tough love to help someone truly grow, hit the subscribe button and share your journey with our community today.